Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the fourth workshop for our EvalFest and third API conference on behalf of Evaluation Community of India and the Asia Pacific Evaluation Association. I welcome you for this fourth workshop. Before we begin the workshop, some housekeeping rules. Please keep your microphone on mute and the video disabled, and also rename your Zoom thing, country, first name, last name. And for questions, if you have any questions, do put it in the chat box. We will pick it up from there, and the facilitators will definitely pick it up from there. Today, we have a very interesting workshop. Next slide, please. Today, we have a very interesting slide presentation and workshop on designing and evaluating for complexity, innovative approaches. And we have with us four very interesting and experienced facilitators. Dr. Sona Mitra, who is the principal economist with IWAGE and an initiative of the lead at Kriya University. Sujata Srinivasan, senior research fellow at lead at Kriya University. Mridulya Narasimhan, Project Heads 3, lead at Kriya University, and Mochan Karthik, data scientist, lead at Kriya University. I call upon Dr. Sona Mitra to take over and facilitate the workshop and introduce her team ahead. Dr. Sona Mitra.
Aniruddha, I'll be taking over.
Okay.
Mridulya here.
Okay, go ahead, Mridulya.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to share my screen. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, and hello everyone. Welcome to today's session as a part of the third APEA conference and EvalFest 2022. I'm Mridulya Narasimhan, as Aniruddha pointed out, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. Why is this session important and why did we want to talk about it? Is development challenges in general are quite inextricably linked which makes them very complex. It makes them interdependent on various factors. This makes it tough to solve a particular development challenge individually. There's a constant need to take a step back, look at the larger picture before you start solving for a development challenge. During our workshop today, what we hope for is that we can give you a glimpse of how complexity in general impacts program ideation, planning, monitoring, evaluation, design, development, all components through the entire project lifecycle. What are the key considerations you need to keep in mind while working through these development challenges? And what are the different hats? What are the multiple hats you have to wear as you solve for these challenges? The session is divided into a few parts. I'll quickly walk you through that. Once I complete my introduction to the workshop as well as to our organization, I'll hand over to Sujata, who will be walking you through how to unpack complexity. What are the key factors and determinants to essentially keep in mind? And what are the key considerations that you need to have handy, or tools you need to have essentially handy. Thereafter, we will actually deep dive into certain parts of an entire project ideation, development, measurement, and evaluation phase. I'll be walking you through the theory of change and what that means in times of complexity. What types of tools are there for theory of changes? We'll also have an activity for you to be done in breakout rooms, where you yourself will develop a theory of change as a group. You will be given sort of constraints and challenges, and how do you essentially keep that in mind and tailor or change your theory of change essentially. We give sort of a 10-15 minute break. It's a bio break, and you can grab a coffee and get back to the workshop for the measurement and evaluation part of it. Measuring what matters will be taken up by my colleague Mochan Karthik, and evaluating complex programs. What are the frameworks, tools, methods that you need to have handy will be covered by Sona Mitra. In the end, we'll have a Q&A session where we can take up all your questions. Regardless of that, during the session, if you have any questions, please post them in the chat And any of the moderators, especially whichever session corresponds to your question, we'll try and get back to you in chat at the earliest. If we miss any questions, there's obviously an opportunity in the end with the interactive Q&A where we can potentially take that up. A little bit about where we come from, what we do. So we're headquartered in Chennai. Lead at Korea University is headquartered in Chennai, India, and we've been in the development sector for about more than 15 years now. We create knowledge for impact with a vision to solve complex challenges and enhance socioeconomic prosperity. We do this by leveraging the power of data, innovation, and co-creation, combining different approaches and different stakeholders and partnerships that we have on board to solve for these challenges. Our founding body, IFMR Society, has over 50 years of experience in higher education and research space. Our work mostly looks at translational and actionable research, focusing on understanding the causes of development challenges. So why is something happening to begin with? What works to solve that challenge? And how do we essentially measure it? How do we measure if it's effectively having the impact that the solution needs to have to solve for that specific problem? We do this through various cross-cutting methods that we have on board, quantitative, qualitative, mixed methods approaches, experimental, some are non-experimental. We conduct all our research in-house with our field staff, and all research from conceptualization till implementation, measurement, and policy uptake is actually taken care of in-house by our own researchers. In addition to that, we also have incubation capacity where we can prototype some of these solutions. So having sort of documented and done research on what works, we also have the capacity for under some of our verticals to essentially look at, can we create a prototype, test it, and sort of tweak it based on our learnings ground up so that it has maximum impact. We work across various sectors. We work in finance. We have a vertical dedicated to small and growing businesses. We do work in health, governance, and environment and climate change as well. All right, so we actually wanted to start off with a quick icebreaker. We wanted to get a sense of all of the participants who are joining us today from different corners of the world. And especially with the pandemic, it's just good to know who we are connected with as a part of this workshop. I'll request my colleague Diksha to launch a poll. You can access this poll by going on the link that's on the screen, the link you see on the screen, and entering the code 916406. Or you can scan the QR code right there and take the questions. There are only 2 questions. We want to know mostly where you're joining us from today. So if you can enter your country name, that would be very helpful. I know some of you have already renamed your name in the participant list, but regardless. And the second is, how much do you know about the topic we're planning to discuss today? I did walk you through a content in the beginning on what we plan to cover. Tell us a little bit about how much you already know. So we'll sort of keep a 1-minute timer for each question, and we can take that up, and I'll just share my screen with the results. Great, we have some responses coming in. We have about 33 responses, 34 so far. I see someone has also incorrectly entered the code here. If you can actually enter your response, please. Maximum participants from India, followed by Philippines at this point in time. We'll give it about 15 more seconds. All right. Great. So I guess India and Philippines is where we have maximum representation from for the day. But good to see so many other countries participating and members from so many other countries joining us today for this workshop. We also hope to learn from you when we do these activities. I think there's a lot to sort of learn from each other and the shared experiences of these countries. Also, a lot of participants from Kenya. Great. Diksha, about 5 more seconds and we can switch to the next question perhaps? Oh, I see a few folks are still entering the room. Maybe we can let them join. Okay, Diksha, can we move to the next question, please? Yeah, I'll wait for a few more, about 15, 20 seconds more. I think we have some more responses coming in. For those of you who have just joined us, you can use the QR code on your screen right now to log on to this poll, or you can join on slido.com, and if you can enter that code on that URL, you should be able to access this question. Good to know about 15% of you, are very adept at what we're planning to discuss today. And a lot of you are also keen to learn and hearing this for the first time. So very happy to see that. We have about 50 responses so far, with about 44% for those who have heard the topic for the first time and or don't know much about the topic and want to know about what this means in practice. Others, 21%, who know a little bit and have been applying it in their work or in their field from time to time. And I see, actually, I stand corrected. I misread the chart earlier. We have about 16% saying hearing about this for the first time. No takers yet for being adept at this specific topic. To be honest, none of us are, but hopefully we can all sort of have a few takeaways for each other from this. Great. We'll give about 10 more seconds and then we can close this poll. I still see people joining in. Thank you so much to those who are participating. We have about 60 responses for this question. Diksha, can I request you to close the poll, please? Thank you so much. Great. All right. So then that brings us to our first part of this session. I see we have a little over 100 participants, and I'm very happy to hand over to Sujata. Sujata will be walking us through how to essentially unpack complexity, what it really means, and how do we account for that as we plan our work in a project, an intervention, an activity as a part of any institution. Sujata, over to you.
Thanks, Mridulya. Can you hear me, Mridulya?
Yes, you're audible.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Hello, welcome everyone. So I guess like Mridulya said, I'll sort of begin by giving you an overview of what exactly complexity is. And when we talk about it from a programming and an evaluation, monitoring and evaluation context. So my presentation is organized around what are some of the key trends that are driving complexity itself in development programming. What are some of the attributes when we talk about simple versus complex programs? What are some of the key attributes that distinguish complex programs from simple programs? And what are some of the challenges, implications for this itself in terms of program implementation, monitoring and evaluation? What are the challenges that they present? And how do you make, as evaluators and researchers, which most of us in this forum are, how do we sort of, embed complexity awareness in how we go about monitoring and evaluation? So I'll give you a very broad overview of some of these concepts. And in the following sessions, my colleagues will get a deep dive into these concepts, provide you case examples from our own work and elaborate on those further. And next slide, please, Mridulya. So in terms of driving trends, right? Prior to 2000s, development programming broadly involved interventions that were rather simple. They were straightforward and sort of narrow in their overall scope, objectives, and their outcomes. But in the last 2 decades, particularly since the early 2000s, there has been a move towards more complex programming in international development. So the what we mean by complexity is that it can be observed in that these programs contain multiple components, they contain multiple levels of implementation, they contain multiple implementing agencies and partners, and they have each with their own agenda, and they have very long and complex causal chains, and with different layers of outcomes at different stages, intermediate, higher order, different levels of outcomes, right? So this is what essentially we are referring to as complexity. So a number of factors have sort of underpinned the shift from simple to complex programming. One of the key factors itself is the launch of the Mdgs in the late 1990s, where member countries, right, committed to addressing complex development issues. It's not something as straightforward as we'll administer vaccines to reduce disease incidence. So more complex development issues like poverty eradication, gender equality, and women's empowerment, environmental sustainability. So all of these issues are very far-reaching in their vision, are intersectional in terms of nature. They demand progress on a larger scale, and they require a very complex program design. So again, now 15 years from the MDGs, now with the launch of SDGs, this level of complexity is more strongly embedded. If you see the sustainable development goals and you see the intersectionalities even across goals, you see how embedded this aspect of complexity itself is within development programming. So now, as a result, there is now growing recognition of the fact that progress towards some of these global goals must take into account multiple causes, must recognize multiple effects, and the role of different actors. Yeah. So parallelly, right, with the launch of these global goals, there was also a greater ODA being pumped in to realize some of these goals. So in the early 2000s, there was a simultaneous movement spearheaded by OECD and other international agencies to improve the quality of aid and its impact on development. A lot of countries, including donors and recipient countries and international agencies, endorsed this movement. And the Paris Declaration was the outcome of this. And through this declaration, sort of the signatories committed to an agenda where countries assume ownership over their development processes. They will be closely engaged in development policy formulation. They will lead the aid efforts, and they will also mobilize local systems for aid delivery. And so again, with impact for understanding results and achieving aid effectiveness being a key concern, ODA also needed to be better managed for results. So developing partners needed to shift focus from into results and how it gets measured. Again, with this comes, so this is also the approach of accountability itself, right? Mutual accountability, and whereby both donors and partners are held accountable for the development results that are being achieved. So this is another key trend that was at the backdrop of this complexity programming. So lastly, with these global goals and country commitments, so in order to for countries to realize their own commitments towards global goals, developing countries aligned themselves to these global developments and shifted towards more country-level programming approaches, as opposed to siloed single intervention approaches. Next slide, Mridulya. So yeah, so what do these trends mean in terms of actual programming, right? On the ground programming, and what does it mean in terms of complexity itself? So basically what this meant was that when earlier the program focus was at a local level, was focused on an activity or specific project or a specific target area level, right? So this shifted from a very narrow level to a much higher level in terms of understanding, clarifying objectives at a country level. Eradicating open defecation, improving women's participation in certain areas. Yeah, sort of achieving progress at much higher levels, whether in terms of at the country level and that aggregating to the regional levels and global levels, and also at a sectoral level. Whether it is water and sanitation, whether it is urban development, whether it is livelihoods. So sort of what is sectoral progress, both at a country level, regional, global. So what is progress that's being realized, and what are the gaps that are getting addressed? So beyond objectives, the idea was also to aggregate outcomes and results at some of these higher levels. So how do we go about doing that? Yeah, we have these objectives at a very high level. So how do we sort of align some of the outcomes and how measurement and evaluation approaches with respect to this itself? And again, when you shift it to a much higher level, the zone of control for a program implementer itself gets diluted a whole lot. There is a lot of environmental and external factors at play. So while on the one hand, there is an emphasis on accountability, there is also greater recognition of the fact that these are complex environments and there is a need for adaptive learning from this, right? So in as much as we want to be accountable for results, we also want to learn from what there is complexity and we have limited control over what we are implementing. So what is it that we can learn? And what is it, how can the learning be replicable, can be adapted in other contexts? So this again was one of the implications from these trends that were happening more externally. Yeah, and lastly, clearly as evaluators and researchers, this has huge implications on our monitoring and evaluation approaches, whether in terms of design, data collection approaches, and how we go about even measuring some of the key indicators that are that are relevant in a complex environment. Next slide, Nduvilya. So yeah, so here I'll talk about some of the key characteristics of complexity itself. Complexity in development program is characterized by many attributes. Some key attributes are that, which I'll talk about here, are they are sort of emergent in nature. What I mean by that is these programs typically involve very emergent and responsive strategies and causal processes. These cannot be completely controlled or predicted in advance. So while as implementers and evaluators, there is an overall goal in mind, the details of the program itself will unfold and change over time as different people become engaged and as new challenges and opportunities emerge in the context. So in these situations, the program design and by extension, the monitoring and evaluation systems have to be able to identify and document some of these emergent patterns. So whether in terms of emerging partners, emerging strategies or outcomes, rather than only paying attention to the objectives and targets that were originally set and identified at the very beginning, these systems need to facilitate an understanding of the emerging trends within these program contexts. So monitoring systems need to capture these patterns. And in the case of evaluation, when earlier it used to be summative, where after the program period you go back and understand to what extent it actually set out to achieve the goals. So here in a complexity setting, the evaluation is more real-time in approach for it to be meaningful, right? And we need to understand what is working. And the idea is also to enable adaptive learning. So how can it inform continued learning so that it's not only at the end of a project period, which could be like, say, 3 years or 5 years, that you actually go back and see the lessons, and when it might be too late to change some of the nature of the program itself. Related to this is also the non-linear nature of these programs, where the process of causality and change can vary from very simple. When you talk about simple programs, there is a very clear linear relationship between the program inputs and the outputs and impacts. Cause and effect can be clearly established, attribution can be established. This is not so in a complex kind of system, where there are multiple pathways that link program inputs to a wide range of outcomes. And you'll see that more when you go through the theory of change exercise that we plan later on. So yeah, in such program context, while there must be, you must be sensitive to initial conditions, again, program implementers and evaluators need to be understand the fact that small actions can actually trigger large reactions. And often these may not be readily predictable, and these may be unexpected. And so these kind of impacts can take place at a very micro or at a macro level as well. So yeah. So as a corollary to this, emergent and non-linear nature of these attributes of complex programs, so they're also, dynamic and uncertain.
I request all participants to please keep yourself on mute. Thank you so much. Yeah, go ahead, Sujata. Sujata, you're not audible.
Yeah, I got muted by the host. Okay. Yeah, can you hear me now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, thanks. Yeah. So so I was talking about the dynamic and uncertain nature of these programs, right? So basically what this means is that there are multiple intervention components. So they differ in their level of complexity, and so the interactions within and among the intervention components and actors, they can and they will change. And all of this may not always be predictable. So processes and outcomes are also unpredictable and cannot be controlled in advance. And large programs may involve many stakeholders, whether be it funding agencies, consultants, government agencies, civil society, and other special interest groups, right? So their interactions and differing priorities and approaches can actually compound the dynamic nature of these programs and can influence some of the outcomes that you want to see through these programs. Yeah. So another aspect of this dynamic and nature, the uncertain nature of these programs is that they're also typically designed and implemented in complex political, socio-cultural, and economic external settings, right? Where outcomes are influenced by many factors beyond the key program stakeholders and key program processes. So here, the program management has very little or almost no control over some of these external factors. And these factors interact in different ways, and they interact differently at different project contexts, different project locations. So the results that you may see within a particular project context may not always be replicable in another context. Yeah. So a project might have a clear and implementation strategy, but it might this might be consistent across project contexts, but the outcomes that you see and how it needs to be adapted can vary across contexts. Yeah. So as evaluators, I guess some of what we need to reflect are and what we need to inquire into, given this dynamic and uncertain nature, is that what went as planned, what did not go as planned, and what factors actually what factors actually influenced the project process, and the outcomes that you observe. So related to that is also the co-evolutionary and adaptive nature of these projects. So as the diverse interventional components and actors come together during implementation, they also begin to respond to context and adapt to each other. So there's a lot of learning and responsiveness built within the program design itself. So the processes become adaptive, ongoing connections, like new connections may emerge. So new stakeholders might be identified who might influence program outcomes in more often positive ways. And there are different components and actors of the intervention. So collectively, we evolve together and becomes more of a co-evolutionary process. Next slide, Mridulya. Yeah. So again, to re-emphasize and to clearly distinguish between how these complex programs actually differ from simple programs, in that there are there are varying levels of program or interventional complexity, and these can be assessed across different dimensions. So to what extent they can be classified as simple or complex depends on how they can be rated along each of these different dimensions. One of the foremost dimensions is that the nature of the program or intervention, for instance, are the project objectives few and are they clearly defined? Do they constitute multiple objectives? How broad are these objectives? And are the program components relatively straightforward, or are there multiple program components? Right? Is the size and scope of the project narrow, affecting a small population, or does it affect a larger population spread across a more wider area? Is the program design well tested? Is it stable, or is it emergent and dynamic? Right? So this is one dimension to consider. Another dimension itself is the causal and change pathway. So this is a pretty important aspect as well. So what I mean by this is, does the program, as evaluators and as program designers, we need to be thinking about whether does the program follow a single linear causal pathway? Does it involve multiple causal pathways which are nonlinear, which are interconnected, and there need to be feedback loops that need to be built in? Is there a relatively high degree of certainty around some of the outcomes, or or is there a low degree? Are the change progress, meaning is it easy to measure or easy to understand? And is there a high agreement among stakeholders around what are the key risks in project implementation itself and how they need to be mitigated? So another dimension itself is the key interactions among stakeholders and institutions. Again, because of the multiplicity of stakeholders and components, it's important to understand what are the key dimensions in terms of interactions. So so when you talk about stakeholders and donor as a stakeholder constituency, so are there the use of funds clearly defined? Or is it more, do each donor emphasize a particular type of utilization of fund? Or is the support more general and utilization can be adapted based on implementation itself, right? And how many agencies are funding the project, and again, how aligned are their goals and interests? So yeah, across these broader dimensions, programs can be classified as either simple or complex. And now there are even checklists that are coming up which development partners have evolved that identify some of these dimensions of complexity and how programs and projects can be rated across these different areas in terms of their level of complexity itself. Yeah. Next slide, Mridulya. Do you want me to take, shall I park this question and take it at the end of the session? I see a question in the chat box. Can ongoing evaluation structures contribute to better? Yeah, so we've seen that, and we'll look at some of the examples later on in the session. Yes, ongoing evaluation structures can contribute to better evaluation processes, because the idea behind complexity itself beyond accountability is to learn along the way. So while yes, evaluation can be formative or summative, more so in formative context, you will learn along the way. And if there is potential for improvement, and you do, as I said, evaluation is real time. And if they are engaged along with the program implementation itself, there is definitely potential for learning along the way and improving the program design along the way as well. I hope that answers your question. So here, right, so this is just more broadly to reiterate the point that I mentioned earlier in terms of, how do you distinguish complex programs from simple programs? So two questions that can actually help some of these, help distinguish this. So what is the, so these are like, what is the degree of certainty about which, about how to solve the problem itself? So among the stakeholders, how certain do we feel that this is a solvable issue? Right? That can tell you whether a program is simple or complex. And what is the degree of agreement among stakeholders about how to solve this problem? Right? To what extent do stakeholders agree on the, and the way in which a program can be approached, way in which program can be designed. Right? So this also can provide a insight into whether a program is complex or simple. And again, where there is a high level of certainty, where there is a high level of agreement among stakeholders, clearly programs will tend to be simple. And the opposite is the case for very complex interventions. So where, we know the problem, but different people have different views on how it can be solved. And yeah, so that leads to, meaning that this clearly signals a very complex kind of environment and the need for a complex design and evaluation. Next slide, Mridulya. So I have 10 more minutes. Is that it? Okay?
About 8 more minutes, yes, Sujata.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So yeah, like I said earlier, as researchers and evaluators, we are foremost concerned with what challenges it presents, right? These kind of complex, programming presents for us. When we want to monitor these projects, when we want to evaluate these projects. So the challenges that they present itself in terms of multiplicity of activities, So how do you, what do you prioritize? And even within activities, what kind of indicators do you prioritize? And do you even monitor at the activity level, or do you need to monitor at an output and outcome level, right? So these are things that, meaning there's clearly a challenge, and there are a lot of trade-offs that need to be made here. And so what are the target populations? Again, here, these programs are involved in relatively large target areas, right? Study areas. So how do you, can target populations be clearly defined? Are they comparable, right? Are these study contexts comparable in terms of population, in terms of external factors? So that's a challenge as well. And can some of these programs, given the nature of complexity, can they be, is it realistic to decide on a timeline right up front? And does this need to be adapted, right? And what does this mean for a monitoring and evaluation if you did need to adapt it, right? So what kind of, so when, say, projects support broad technical support, and budget allocations are broad as well. So is there a possibility for, say, if you did want to assess cost effectiveness of certain activities? So is there a possibility for this itself? So these are challenges. So in terms of stakeholders, again, the multiplicity of the stakeholders itself is a challenge. Their competing interests and priorities and their influence on the program design, that's a challenge. And how do you navigate that? And how do you build that into the monitoring and evaluation system? So baseline is another area where, in a simple, straightforward trial, you clearly know define your study area, and you have your, your baseline parameters that you your outcome variables, the baseline characteristics that you want to understand, and it is clear to establish that. But that's not necessarily so in a complex setting, more because they take place in diverse contexts. They take place over a larger program area. It's difficult to compare, target populations. So given the adaptive nature of it, even baseline, what you might find in baseline might really not hold much meaning for how you want to design the monitoring and evaluation approach, right? Is it really possible to capture some of the key changes, right? Know some of the changes even upfront to be able to define indicators right at the outset, right? That's a challenge. And the feasibility, again, given how broad the scope is, how feasible is it to even undertake a baseline, large-scale baseline effort across this diverse context? Again, all of this also relates to counterfactuals. So there is diversity in context, there is diversity in populations. So clearly there is going to be difficulty. How can we use comparisons? What are comparison groups even? And how do we identify clear counterfactuals? Is attribution even possible, or is that even necessary and relevant, right? Because even if we did have a counterfactuals, are we going to be able to clearly compare some of the outcomes across the different groups? So yeah, these are the broad monitoring and evaluation challenges. Next slide, Mridulya. Yeah. So now that we have seen some of the challenges in complex programs, right? I'll briefly talk about how monitoring and evaluation mechanisms can be made more responsive to these program contexts. So I'll just give a broad overview. Later on in this session, my colleagues will delve deeper into these aspects and illustrate them with case examples and activities from our own projects. So as you all know, performance, all of us are familiar with performance monitoring practice. Basically, it involves collecting baseline data, setting targets, and comparing actual figures to these targets to understand progress in performance. So the indicators in this approach itself are typically designed to measure progress towards clearly well-defined, predefined outcomes, and according to predefined implementation plans, right? So again, this approach usually works pretty nicely for simple program components where cause-effect relationships are known and can be predicted, and where there is widespread agreement amongst program stakeholders on what is the problem, what are potential solutions, right? But again, this is not so in, and these are all concepts that I sort of touched upon earlier. So when when program components don't meet any of these criteria, so that's when complexity comes into play, and there is need for complexity-aware monitoring approaches, right? And again, these approaches, while they don't need to be divorced from your performance monitoring approaches. They can go very much hand in hand, and they in fact need to be undertaken in conjunction with your conventional performance monitoring approaches. So, so what are some of the key factors that we need to keep in mind when we talk about complexity-aware monitoring, right? So there are definitely blind spots. So we know what is performance monitoring, and from that we can sort of infer what are potential blind spots in performance monitoring systems. One is clearly that they tend to focus primarily on a clear causal link between interventional inputs, activities, and outcomes. Right? They are built on very predictable linear causal pathways. So they are blind to the broader nature of outcomes associated with the intervention. These could be intended outcomes, these could be unintended outcomes, these could be positive outcomes or negative outcomes, right? So the gamut of outcomes that are possible through a program is cannot be readily captured through a performance monitoring system. Again, when you look at the assumptions underlying some of the causal pathways, right? There could be multiple causes and actors and factors that influence these. So performance monitoring systems may not be able to capture some of these alternate causes. So, and there are also other non-linear pathways, right? That contribute to observed outcomes. Again, here again, this again is a blind spot within performance monitoring approaches. So the thing is, while ignoring some of these may be adequate for simple projects and interventions, it'll grossly undermine some of the dynamics within complex program context, and will undermine some of the outcomes that you see as well, right? When you don't recognize them, when you don't capture them. So yeah. So in programming environments of complexity, so where the ability to predict outcomes in causal pathways is low, the evaluation alone is insufficient to the evaluation needs to be built in such that it can steer the implementation as well. It can make the implementation a lot more effective. This sort of answers the question that one of the participants has as well. So basically, this calls for monitoring approaches that recognizes complexity and that can track. So it could mean adapting some of the indicators, some of the capturing some of the processes, capturing some of the outcomes as they emerge, and if possible, even before they emerge, right? So being very responsive to the process itself. So, and yeah, secondly, the pace of change, right? How do you recognize the pace of change? The characteristics of complex problems that we discussed earlier, whether in terms of the dynamic nature, the emergent nature, as well as the fact that they take place in complex external environments, essentially mean that these programs need to adapt to context. So as the program adaptation changes, sometimes it may be rapid, sometimes it may be slow. So, but as the program adaptation changes to match the pace of change in the context, the monitoring mechanisms must change as well to adapt to it, right? So they must be tuned into the implementation process, and they must be actively engaged in the operating environment itself. So in these highly dynamic contexts, monitoring must take place on a more frequent basis, or maybe even on an ongoing basis. But at the same time, if you know that some of these results are that you're looking to see are going to take time to evolve, so then putting in place monitoring mechanisms that capture measuring them more frequently, that does not make sense, right? So you sort of observe and you adapt your monitoring systems accordingly, depending on the pace at which the program is changing. So, but essentially the principle is that regardless of how fast or slow paced the program is changing, monitoring systems must be fluid enough to adapt to this, and must be also, must be capturing information, leading information, like be predicting some of the risks. Your risks may be unknown even at the outset, but the program monitoring system should be able to predict risks just even before that they occur, right? So those kind of mechanisms need to be built in as well. So that again, there is adaptive learning, and there is improvement that's happening, and there is course correction, potential for course correction itself in these projects. So lastly, these monitoring systems also need to capture the interrelationships and the perspectives and boundaries. I'll basically, what this means is just that, given the multiplicity of the different stakeholders and processes, does the monitoring system track the dynamics between the different components? Do different actors, does it capture the perspective of the different actors that are involved? And does it understand the boundaries within which the project is operating? So these are aspects that the monitoring mechanisms need to recognize as well. Last slide, Mridulya.
Also a quick time check, Sujata.
Okay, I'll just rush through this. Yeah, so basically from an evaluation standpoint, what this means is that when you don't, pay attention to complexity, it can have serious implications for the practical utility of the evaluation findings itself. So when different factors influencing outcomes are not well understood, it dilutes the effectiveness of findings and their ability to inform policies and practice. So in our experience, we've also observed that the policymakers and practitioners don't often view very simple and straightforward findings, right? They don't see them as meaningful or as having practical utility. So, again, simple conventional evaluations fail to capture some of the externalities and unintended effects of these programs, spillover effects of these programs. So, like if you look at a trial, you often capture only the average effects on the total population. You're not really looking at disaggregated effects, and particularly consequences on vulnerable groups, right? So these are not effectively captured within simple evaluations. So, which is why this calls for, these types of programs call for some complexity sensitive approaches in evaluation. So what are some of the factors that you keep in mind? One, definitely program, as you heard, flexibility is definitely critical given the attributes that I discussed with respect to complexity. Yeah, and so there is also need for, so if you are operating with the program theory of change, there is also a need for reconstruction of this at the time of summative evaluation itself, right? Just to understand, does this match with what you had originally intended? And if no, what are the changes, right? What are the deviations and what are the reasons for some of this? So evaluation needs to build in this component as well. So evaluations must also be looking at gathering multiple lines of evidence and on the validity and relevance of the causal links. So triangulation of findings is a very critical component, right? From different sources is a very critical component. It is integral to these types of evaluations. And also the evaluations must focus more on process use rather than on process evaluations. So by that, I mean, when you talk about process evaluation, you're really talking about assessing to what extent program activities and processes were implemented as planned, right? But within a complex evaluation context, you are more questioning and reflecting on an evolving process and examining what is valuable and what can enable learning and course correction. So yeah, and lastly, these evaluations must be designed to consider alternative factors, alternative explanations that contribute to observed results. And sort of, we should be reviewing the overall narrative and evidence to explain the program contribution. And I mean contribution and not attribution, program contribution to observed results. So that brings me to the end of my presentation.
Thank you so much, Sujata. I think there's also another question from Sabina and also from one other of our delegates. If you can maybe take that in the chat itself, just given time constraints, that would be very helpful. But thank you so much for setting context of on what we plan to discuss with the rest of the workshop. Which brings us to sort of the next session, which is on theory of change and how do we move from a simple to a complexity-informed theory of change in general. So just a quick note on the evolving nature of theory of changes in general. I mean, although there's no way to pinpoint when the term was essentially, originated. It was coined somewhere around 1990s, 1995, by methodologists who were trying to look at how do we look at mapping the entire journey, mapping the stakeholders, mapping everyone who's involved in the implementation of a particular program or an intervention, without making it extremely, incorporating all of these elements without making it extremely linear or sort of extremely limited to certain activities. But that said, in some form or the other, some version of theory of change has been existing for a long time, and it has mainly served the purpose to plan, design, and deliver a particular programs. It's mostly outcomes based in that sense, the idea being that you have an outcome in mind in the sense of what you want to achieve with the work, in terms of problem statement that you want to solve, and you work backwards from there to sort of see how would you measure that, what are the activities that would be required to achieve that, and for that said activity, what are the resources you'd require, what is the environmental factors or constraints that need to be sort of conducive for that activity or the program to take place. Sort of a precedence or one step before theory of change was log frames, very much still in use. They have certainly slight differences in the way they try to capture a process or an activity, and I will bring that up a few slides ahead. But what has been seen is that with time, as we're realizing that, as Sujata rightly pointed out, that challenges are more and more complex with each passing day. There are more and more stakeholders involved. It's certainly not a linear process. There's been discussion about, well, how do we make the existing tools work? So if we have log frames, if we have theories of change, how do we take it to the next level where we're able to incorporate this complexity? And that's what we'll try and sort of focus on a little bit today. So broadly speaking, this is any activity or project's life cycle in general, right? So starting from problem identification, stakeholder identification, hypothesis, goal setting, hypothesis on how you plan to achieve or solve for that problem, goal setting, making sure you have all the stakeholders on board, designing the activity in itself, making sure there's all the resources available for that particular activity, implementation. And then as you implement it, you realize that there are maybe things that we may have missed. There are changes that are happening either in the policy space, either in the environmental space that we need to incorporate. So there's a course correction that we need to do, monitoring and evaluation, learning. So basically, broadly speaking, ideation, planning, implementation, M&E, and then scale up. Now, theory of change, apart from the ideation phase, which is when you're even trying to figure out what is it that we really want to address and how we can potentially get there, that is perhaps the place where theory of change doesn't have as crucial a role. But thereafter, in the entire process of planning, implementation, M&E, and scale up, it plays a rather crucial role. So in the planning and implementation phase, it helps you realize what are the activities that you must accomplish in order for you to reach that desired goal. Who are the key stakeholders involved for each of these activities to take place? Is there a key assumption we're making when we are trying to identify a specific activity? The assumption could be that you perhaps have, buy-in from all relevant stakeholders. The assumption could be that what you know about the problem itself is indeed the problem, right? So there are certain assumptions that we make when we are coming up with these activities which lead to the theory of change, many of which, of course, can be changed over the course of the study and the program in itself, because you're learning constantly about what's working, what's not working. In the implementation, post the implementation, in the monitoring and evaluations phase, theory of change sort of helps you realize how will we measure what we need to measure, what needs to be measured first, how will we measure it, and then sort of devise an evaluation strategy based on that. Again, as Sujata had pointed out, this is something that you will have to constantly update over a period of time. And in scale up, where it plays a role is in terms of dissemination and learning. It's very easy to pictorially represent or have a clear representation, clear and brief representation of your entire journey as a program, to say, what is it that you started off with? What did you accomplish? What did you aim to have an impact on? Did you achieve that impact or not? It's sort of a very templatized model that you can take to any stakeholder, any donor, any funder, and sort of let them know that there is potential in this program and that it has the potential to scale up. This is perhaps what we know about theory of change. So a simple logic model, which is nothing but a graphical representation of the theory of how an intervention will produce its outcomes. There is no one model for representation. Many organizations, many institutions have come up with multiple ways of representing their theory of change. It has gotten more and more creative over time, perhaps even more intuitive over time. But what we know is these 4 or 5 steps that you see on your screen right now. Impact, what you aim to achieve in order to address the given problem. How will you achieve it? The outcomes that you want to derive from that impact. Activities, how will you achieve it? What are you proposing? And what is the output that will be coming from each of those activities, and the resources that you'll need for each of the activities. The 2 other additions here that I just want to briefly mention is, one, the stakeholders that you need to definitely map when you're planning for your activities. And yes, the stakeholder pool is quite large, but the idea is to basically ensure that you have buy-in from each of the key stakeholders before you start activity implementation. So making sure that all those who are relevant in terms of your program implementation, but also have the capacity to catalyze what you create as impact thereafter. They are involved in that conversation from get-go. And they, in some sense, are able to collaboratively sign off on what you see as the theory of change or the pathway of impact of your specific program. That's one. The other is assumptions, like I mentioned earlier, and it's very, very, very important to sort of identify your assumptions, and be open to coming back and changing those assumptions as time passes and as you learn more when you implement the program. For those who are perhaps even new to theory of change, just wanted to show a case in point on perhaps how knowledge of a problem. So in this case, as you see on your screen, 2 different sort of channels of pathways to impact. Same problem that we're trying to address, that, I'm always late to work. But the idea here that I'm trying to showcase is that for any given challenge that you're trying to address, there are multiple ways to get through to that same challenge. There are multiple ways to identify how to address that specific problem. On your left side, you have an example of the key issue being perhaps traffic or leaving, your house late, which is probably because you're waking up late, and you identify slowly the root causes. And then you create a channel of impact saying, all right, assuming these are the root causes that we have come up with, how can I address that? If the root cause is that I'm, sleeping late, and that's why I'm waking up late, and I'm sleeping late because there are either too many chores that I need to finish in the, at night, maybe I'm watching Netflix, or I'm sleeping late, or I'm out late with friends. That could be one way of identifying your root causes and planning for that, saying, okay, let's set a time at maybe 10:30, 11, beyond which I will not watch, let's say Netflix or whatever we're binging on. And with time, as those processes progress, you get from getting to bed on time to waking up on time to getting ready on time and getting to office on time. That's one way to look at it. But another lens to that same problem could also be that you've identified that your root cause is perhaps not the fact that you're sleeping late, but also the fact that You have a late start in your morning, and that's maybe because you do some chores in the morning, you like reading in the morning. So then if that's the case, what would the theory of change be like? How do you accommodate for that specific root cause? So depending on the problem, depending on the root cause you identify, there are multiple ways to achieve that same impact. And in that example, the impact here essentially being getting to work on time. The question is, this is something we know about theory of change, and this process has been there for quite some time. So then the question essentially is, why do we need to even bother with complexity? What is it essentially we are trying to look at? And what we are trying to essentially look at here is that simple problems may have a more linear approach. But that said, and again, as Sujata had pointed out earlier, many of the challenges that we see today are not as simple. They are rather not even complicated, but more complex than not. So how do we essentially define these differences? This framework was actually shown by Glauberman and Zimmerman in a paper in 2002, where they basically just give you 3 basic examples of simple, complicated, complex. A simple problem could be something like you want to create, your favorite dish. There's a recipe, you need to follow it. And that's sort of a simple problem. Yes, it takes a little bit of tweaking. You may have to go back and forth. You may not get it right the first time. But as long as you have mastered the skill and you're following all the instructions, you're able to get from point A to point B, from an unfinished product to your favorite recipe, consistently over a period of time. A complicated problem could be something like sending a rocket to the moon, or in today's scenario could be developing a COVID vaccine, for example, right? Which is that formula is obviously critical. There are elements at play that you may not always be privy to. And the scale essentially, or being able to complete this complicated problem or resolve this complicated problem, requires some high level of expertise. That you need to have in mind. The third is perhaps, let's say, raising a child, which is a fairly complex problem. And why is it complex? Complex because each individual is different. Complex because there are sort of human elements at play here. There are multiple stakeholders involved in raising a child. And so it's not a straightforward process as such. There's no set formula. There's no set process that you can follow to get from point A to point B. There's a fair level of uncertainty of outcomes, right? So depending on how you raise a child and how the child grows up to be, it's a fairly evolved, uncertain process. And development challenges are very similar to that last problem idea, right? Which is that it is a complex problem. There are many people involved. There's no clear answer. There's no clear answer for what works in one location. Is it the same for what works in another location? What works in one point in time for a particular problem, like let's say education? Will it hold true even 5-10 years from now? That's what makes development challenges fairly complex. There are 4 key elements to what that is. 1, unique local conditions, which I just mentioned. Second, interdependency, the number of people involved, the stakeholders who need to be a part of that conversation to resolve for that challenge. Third is non-linearity, and this is something that Sujata has mentioned, and you'll continue to hear about this in the subsequent sessions too, that there is no clear linear path on how to essentially get from your activities or your problem input all the way to resolving that problem or to creating impact. And the last is the capacity to adapt, which is essential for something like a development challenge, because as you implement, there will constantly be new insights that come from that implementation process. There will constantly be challenges, constraints that we have to account for, maybe even policy changes. And so it's important to sort of keep that in mind as we are trying to solve for a development challenge. The idea is not necessarily to, and this is something we had seen earlier, but the idea is not to say we know this much and the rest is complexity. There is clearly a zone of complexity that exists. The idea is to systemize that. There has to be trial and error that has to constantly happen. We know that. In order to come up with a solution, we'll constantly have to keep trying for new things. Maybe one intervention won't work, another would. An intervention in itself may have to be changed multiple times before it has the intended impact. The idea is to try and systemize that trial and error in itself. The idea is that we expand the scope of plan and control, as you see it on your screen, and reduce that sort of zone of complexity. And the way to do that is essentially to plan, keeping in mind multiple stakeholders, keeping in mind all the activities and steps that would be involved in implementing your project, and making sure there's a fairly robust monitoring and evaluation system in place for you to implement that. Just wanted to briefly also take this opportunity to touch upon designing a complexity involved theory of change. What would that actually mean? And there is a lot of body of literature that talks about the importance of systems thinking, the importance of moving away from the traditional thinking format of one thing that leads to another, but also keeping in mind the role of multiple stakeholders and multiple players in order to have impact. And also because this has any given action, not only has a linear impact on the next subsequent action, but there could be a ripple effect. There could be multiple implications of each decision taken within a project. So it's important to, in some sense, to the extent that we can, account for that when we are creating a theory of change. I wanted to take an example here. So in the previous theory of change that I had shown you, which is a simple logic model where one leads to another, input to activities, to output, to outcomes, to impact, given a problem statement, given assumptions, given stakeholders, right? What it perhaps does not account for is the fact that there may be multiple other things at play. And here's an example for you. So if you think of the current situation we are in, the pandemic in itself, you see this sort of causal loop, which you see on your screen in red, right? Which is basically to say that there's a very clear linear path and there's a very clear idea of how transmission events can lead to more people being infected with the COVID-19. Leading to a risk in transmission. And that's sort of a causal loop that we have there. But that said, does it perhaps take in mind the perceived public risk with regards to COVID? Does it take in mind perhaps public awareness about COVID-19? Does it take in mind information symmetry when it comes to perhaps vaccine availability? How does that play a role? And each of these, you'll notice, of course, we may have a positive or a negative effect on a subsequent activity, but they're all fairly related. And one particular activity can lead to an impact on what is it that you're trying to achieve or what is it that you're trying to measure, right? In that same example of the logic model I'd taken earlier, I'd shown earlier about getting late to work and how you can work backwards from that, right? Think about what are the other factors that could play a role that we may not have accounted for, that may not be about the individual itself. It may not be just because you have slept late at night and watched too much Netflix. It may not be just because you've woken up in the morning and you have chores. It could be that the public transportation system, is not great where you're living, let's say, and that gets you late to work more often than not. More buses break down than you actually anticipate or imagine. Or let's say, does it account for maybe even a positive factor? Let's say, what would be the effect or impact if your office put an incentive mechanism in place that said, those who come into work early will be that there will be some benefit for them, right? How does it account for that? Does that maybe change completely the way you're thinking about the problem? Does it change the activities or the steps you would possibly take to resolve for that problem? So there are multiple stakeholders, multiple situations involved. It is not always possible to know everything or account for all of these at any given point in time. But the idea is to, when you're planning and with the help of multiple stakeholders, look at all of these multiple potential scenarios, at least account for them. And then with time, come back, see how many of them hold true, how many you can potentially change, how many of them need to be perhaps adapted, and what change does it cause in your program in itself or the theory of change thereafter. All right, I quickly wanted to show what this meant for one of the projects that we had taken up during the pandemic over the last 2 years. The objective of this project, it was an impact assessment that we had taken on. And the objective of the project was to measure the impact of certain interventions, health interventions that our partner in this case had implemented. It was an alliance of partners, so multiple partners together, and they had decided that they want to implement 7-8 interventions that are all health related during this time to try and see if they can maybe improve health outcomes and have more real-time data during the time of the pandemic. The idea was to also create a feedback loop. So let's implement these interventions. Let's see what we learned from it. And then come back and see either if we need to change any of these interventions or activities or program ideas to achieve that same impact. So I wanted to show what this essentially meant in a linear format first. The idea was to get human resources, equipment, funding from each of these partners to implement these 6-7 interventions that you see on screen, which is the COVID crisis, a COVID crisis hotline, home care services, oxygenation services, which was key at least in India at that point in time, training and capacity building, vaccination services, and also looking at sort of policy side of it. So science alliance, how can this information be communicated to the external world, to policy stakeholders, and if there is any potential to do any other tech solutions. The idea was that this should ideally lead to early identification of and reduce the burden thereafter on the healthcare system itself, to make sure that the health workers are equipped with not only skills, but also the required resources, whether it's oxygen machines or perhaps any other tools that they would require, so that there are better health outcomes for the community. And the end impact that we were trying to look at with this was a timely and equitable health service access during an emergency response. Right? This is how it was planned linearly. And the assumption here was, of course, that our alliance members were all equally committed to make this change happen. COVID-19 was clearly a health priority at that point in time. So all resources, all efforts need to be channeled towards that. Digital solutions were a key, given that the pandemic required physical proximity was no longer possible. So it required us to move perhaps to digital solutions, and that an intervention, like a single intervention, would not work. So we needed a group of interventions to work together, sort of a basket approach in some sense, so that we can achieve the required impact. Now, when we started digging deeper into the activities and we started planning for this as a group, a couple of things we realized. The first thing we realized is that activities are not linear. So if you look at these, you'll realize that all the activities are mapped out and the impact for that is clearly shown. But each of these activities too were related to one another in some sense, right? So whether it is about cultivating the alliance in itself and including more stakeholders into that conversation, into that project, or it was about the advocacy and learning that came from the project itself, whether it was about building knowledge around what we know about the pandemic, what we know about the interventions, their the expected impact, they were all correlated. And the interventions that we were actually planning for, so whether it's oxygenation or healthcare worker services, training, all of that was feeding into one or two of these other activities. So they were all sort of clearly linked in some sense, which at first glance we hadn't quite initially accounted for, right? And as you start the discussions, it starts to become more and more clear. The second thing, though, that became evident is as we started mapping the activities and the stakeholders. So the stakeholders that you see are in the dark blue boxes, and the activities are the light blue, which I had shown earlier. So home care, oxygenation, etc. When we started seeing each activity not as an individual unit, but sort of its role in achieving the larger impact, we realized each activity had informed something or the other for multiple stakeholders. That was one. So it wasn't that home care was just linked to one particular stakeholder. It played a role across. The second thing we realized, and I pointed this out in the earlier slide, is even between activities, there was a lot of linkage, right? So health worker training, for example, provided some information or some sort of feedback loop into home care. It improved services. It, in some sense, was obviously already linked to hospitals. We also realized from government for healthcare training, there was a need for reskilling, perhaps, given that there was little information available about how to cope with the pandemic, and we were sort of learning new things each passing day in the last 2 years. So there was a role for perhaps government to play there. So we realized for each of them, there's a level of interconnectedness that we had not accounted for. Each activity could not work in a silo. And as we start to plan for this, even before implementation or even before getting into the evaluation of this, we started to realize that there are multiple sort of causal links that we had to essentially look at. And there were multiple stakeholders that we needed to essentially account for. Before we go into an activity, and this is why I want to give a small heads up, is I do see that few folks are logged in from their phones. So if possible, please do log in from a tablet or your laptops, because the activity which will be coming up next is actually on Jamboard. So you'll be able to access it and actually will be able to provide inputs better if you have access to those. If you do not, we'll help coordinate for that. So not an issue. Now, we know what a linear theory of change looks like. We know what are the elements we need to look at in terms of complexity. But what essentially happens if, let's say, the plan changes? If the plan essentially changes midway, if there's a change in the theory of change midway, how does your theory of change adapt for that? If there in your program in itself, there's a change midway. The first thing is you need to design a theory of change, keeping in mind the outcomes and not the activities. So it can't be that we have an activity or an intervention, let's map the theory of change. You have to work backwards from what is it that you're really trying to solve for, what is the impact that you're really trying to create. When you do that, you'll notice what essentially happens is that even if the activities, any of the activities changes, you're totally able to adapt your theory of change regardless, still achieving the same impact, same potential outcomes, but the way of getting there perhaps could have changed over a period of time. This is also especially true for larger projects. So something may not change as quickly within a year, but the second the project crosses the threshold of a couple of years, multiple changes can happen from stakeholders to policies, etc. So this helps account for that. The second is that the theory of change should be modified and reviewed. I've stressed on this a few times before, and that very much holds true. There is a constant need to come back and see if your hypothesis has changed, if your findings are being measured, monitored differently, and if that finding then feeds back into activities and you're changing activities, what is the ripple effect of that? What impact does it have on your output and your outcomes? And the last is to have sort of a multi-stakeholder approach. As I mentioned earlier, it's important to see that everyone has buy-in. I'll take an example here. Let's say you have your theory of change, and the theory of change is Smart tabs in education lead to better attendance, and better attendance leads to better learning outcomes, right? That's what you're trying to essentially achieve. Now, let's say the donor pulls out and says, we cannot provide support on smart tabs anymore. Like, we are backing out, right? What does that do to your theory of change? Now, you are still looking for better outcomes. You're still looking for better learning outcomes. That still remains. Perhaps your activity changes. Perhaps instead of doing a smart tab training, you can move to maybe gamification. So same channel of impact. Gaming and interactive learning leads to better attendance, leads to better learning outcomes. But your theory of change, if you think about these two examples, your activities and some of the way you would measure these activities, that would have substantially changed. So that's why it's important to keep revisiting your theory of change in this sense. All right. For this activity, we'll actually move to a Jamboard, like I mentioned. I'd request Deeksha to place the links in the chat. The idea of what we're trying to do is you'll be split up into 4 different breakout rooms. In each breakout room, as the first step of the activity, you'll create your own theory of change. There's a template already there. There are some suggestive responses already there. So as a team, the idea is for you to build on that. The second is you'll be creating something called a nested theory of change, which looks something like this. So for any given activity, you will pick a specific activity and say, all right, for this, what does the intervention look like and what are the steps required to achieve it? This is to give you a sense of the fact that even for each activity, there is a possibility to have a theory of change, and you have to take sort of a macro picture, keeping that in mind. And third, we have a scenario for you. So we'll give you a scenario and see what change it creates on your theory of change. So that said, Deeksha, can we move to our individual rooms? Hi, thanks everyone. Quite an interactive session, although very directly on the Jamboard itself, but a lot of people pitching in, which was very happy to see. We'll just take a couple of more seconds to let everyone back in. Deeksha, I see you here. Karthik, Preeti, so we're all back, it seems like. Great. So we wanted each of the groups to actually just quickly walk us through what is the key intervention they identified and what their nested theory of change, at least pictorially speaking, looks like, and what key change happened when we gave you the scenario of the education CEO no longer having buy-in or no longer buying into this idea per se. If I can maybe request our team, and this is also an opportunity, perhaps we have a moderator in each of the, or a speaker for each of the breakout rooms. If others want to quickly take a bio break or grab a coffee while that is ongoing and come back to us immediately, please do not log off. Please stay online while you do that. We can maybe start with our group. Sabina, would you like to walk us through the theory of change? And if you'd like me to share my screen, please let me know. Happy to do that.
Yes, I think it will be helpful. I'm trying to enlarge my image to here. So we have the program, a pilot program, as we established, having as impact young adolescents getting jobs and being career ready. Our inputs, considered inputs, was finding funds and vocational trainers. The main activities were vocational training, improve the capacity of vocational training institutes to deliver programs that make youth job ready. In the second step of our exercise, we have chosen improve the capacity of vocational training and institutes to deliver programs that make youth job ready. We have seen that each theory of change can be itself transformed in the whole other theory inside the main one. We have also presented a lot of activities from this main activity to get to our output, outcome and impact. In the third phase, our CEO was changed, and we try to adapt to this change. And one of the proposal was to involve the Ministry of Education as it is a main stakeholder, and also to work as a team with the other stakeholders to get our program work and find other founders to keep the program on.
All right. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that, Sabina. And also just to give everyone a quick glance of our nested theory of change, the intervention we identified, the activity we identified was to improve capacity of vocational training institutes. The intervention for that was APEA provides training of trainers, APEA just being a name we took randomly at this point in time. And the activities that are required to make this specific intervention happen. So for APEA to be able to provide training of trainers, what are the sub-activities? And that's something we had identified as a part of our nested theory of change work. Deeksha, can I hand over to you and your team, please?
Sure, thanks, Mridulya. I'll share my screen, and we have Manju Maharjan from our group who will be walking us through this. Manju, over to you.
Thank you. So, can I start? So for the impact, the young adolescent are job or career ready. So for that, we have discussed in our group that young people feel encouraged and supported by the immediate social support circle with families, peers, community leaders, and also more programs that absorb young people at early age. So for that impact, we have discussed the outcome as improved learning outcomes, better understanding of skills or interest to potential jobs, and focal identified. And for that outcome, the output was discussed as sensitization conducted, and numbers of training institutions created, number of people trained, conduct livelihood training, number of satisfied trainees measured by questionnaire, and number of people trained who are actually getting jobs, and number of training programs conducted to upskill unemployed. So for those outputs, the following activities were discussed, like, for example, vocational training school, training for teachers, stakeholders analysis, and rebuilding training and skill development coursework, skill training in schools for at early age, adapting the school curriculum, internship goals, conduct livelihood training, tailoring training, curriculum for different youth segments, especially disadvantaged groups. So another activities like involve corporates in designing courses in line with what they look for potential employees. So for those activities, what inputs were discussed were like job training, teachers and equipment, human resources materials used for training, stakeholders are identified who can be drivers and supporters to young people, teachers capable of conducting early capacity development for work, financial support provided for upskilling programs, and government subsidies and legal instruments for promoting employment of youth. So while discussing this whole process, there are some assumptions that we listed where a business, available market jobs trained for youth, training offered is enough to secure jobs, no social barriers for girls to work, teachers, youth, adolescent, Ministry of Education, parents, and education departments see you as assumptions and barriers. So yeah, this all are we discuss about, and from here we choose one of the activities, which was vocational training integrated in schools, and for that we identify the identification of school was intermediate planning for formulation of curriculum, partnering with training institutions to conduct training, needs assessment, creating awareness, identifying students' interest, market research, and engaging with participants and their families to ensure their participation and ownership, inclusive training design, engendering the design. So this way we selected one of the activities and further discussed. Yeah.
Thanks,
So,
Manju.
yeah, thank you.
So I think we have the green sticky notes here, which look at how we would adapt the programs. Would you like to go over these as well?
Okay, so in case of some designing a linear and theory of changes, in case of some complexities, there we added the point as a financial support from department no longer available, external funding may be needed to continue. And a second point we added was modifying the program to incorporate the new CEO's thoughts on instructional design, understanding the barriers. Yeah, back to you. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Manju. Yeah, Mridulya, over to you.
Thank you so much, Diksha. Preeti, over to you and your team to present, please.
Thanks, Mridulya. I will share my screen now. But we're room number 4. Did you want to go with Karthik first?
That's fine. We can go start with you and can move to Karthik, not a problem.
I hope this is visible. So Subhadra, you want to take it forward?
Yes, thank you, Preeti. So as part of our group, we were trying to work our way backwards from the impact down to the inputs. So we looked at, of course, young adolescents for them to be job ready, and to see how young people are in actually employment already, because one of our group members talked about how some people are underemployed. The next point is regarding unemployment rate. Will be, of course, the impact we're looking at is also reduce unemployment. We're also looking at, okay, so if we look at, say, if you look down at our assumptions and enablers, we are looking at, say, enablers the stakeholders who are part of the enablers here are vocational training institutions, recruiters, young people who live in stable households, government bodies and MSMEs, industries and education departments. We're also assuming that several assumptions regarding that there are jobs existent out there for young people to take up, that there are students who want to work. And Preeti, if I may ask you to zoom in a little bit, I cannot see what was written in the first note.
Is that better, Subhadra?
Yeah, just a minute. Yeah, anyways, just moving forward, I would like to talk about the outcomes to see how, so okay, if we may just like change position and say we're looking at inputs and then to move to outcomes, how government schemes that provide scholarships to students to be much, in a sense, give some kind of leverage to students to come to take these trainings, have training materials that are provided, have well-funded vocational institutions. The activities that will be directly involved are skill training, vocational training, conducting industry visits as part of vocational training, and facilitating workshops where employers can provide job requirements to learners who are getting into trainings. The kind of outputs that we're looking at are the number of students who participate, the number of trainings that are conducted, and of course, the number of people who are trained consequently. With regard to outcomes, we're looking at how learning outcomes have been improved, how more young people have employable skills, and how skills have improved based on the tests conducted, and how young people actually have skills that are required by the industries. So this was what we looked at in the first go. If any of my groupmates want to pitch in, if I've missed anything. Okay, so if we go to the next issue, when we picked up one particular activity and tried to understand subcategories of those activities, we picked up vocational training or skill training for youth, and we looked at various number of things that come under it. So first thing that we looked at was the recruitment of trainers who would conduct such trainings, screening of potential trainees, determining training modules that could be online or offline, identifying skills that would be required, dividing these skills into technical and non-technical skills.
Sorry, Preeti, we're losing your screen, I think.
And developing training modules and curriculums as part of this major activity that would be conducted. With regard to the third slide, where we were discussing if any one stakeholder would pull out, we were looking at vocational training institutes in case this stakeholder pulls out, in terms of say institutions that may not work or may not have the resources enough to provide this kind of training. So we looked at what kind of activities would in fact collapse under it. We had a discussion in and around it, and we had a very interesting input where one of our members talked about how even if say vocational institutes may not be functioning and that the outcomes may be delayed, we will certainly have something else that may come up in its place. So that kind of rebounding, that kind of being able to get back on our feet was something that was discussed. If you may, Preeti may requested to go to the third slide so that I can display that. Yes. So what we said was that perhaps it will delay activities being conducted and may perhaps also reduce quality of trainings that are to be conducted. However, also we had one of our members who talked about how conversely, if students went directly on site and started to learn, it could in fact benefit them more. So it could actually swing both ways. So that was in short like what we discussed, and would request any of my groupies who want to pitch in case I missed something.
Thanks, Subhadra. That's very interesting. And I think there seems to be commonality across at least some of the groups so far on maybe finding a replacement for that stakeholder when we're discussing the scenario. Many have thought of funders, others have thought of perhaps government officials who could pitch in, could have the influence in getting the program the reach and impact that it needs. Great. Karthik, last but not the least, over to you.
Thanks, Mudlia. Let me just share my screen and I just quickly summarize our team's discussions.
Sounds good.
Is my Jamboard visible?
Yes, it is good.
Just a minute. Yeah, so our team had a very fruitful discussion on what would be the theory of change for the particular impact that we're measuring. Let me just zoom in a bit. So I'll just highlight the interesting things that we came up with. So in terms of activities, like something that we came up with was having a digital platform for e-learning. The reason being currently the youth almost all of them have access to smartphones, and they access so much content online. So we thought that having a digital platform for e-learning could be a good activity that we should. And also other activities like development of relevant training modules, and then also important thing is like development of soft skills also, like apart from vocational skills. We also identified training on soft skills also required as an activity to ensure that the youth are trained enough to be ready for jobs. And in terms of outcomes, apart from improved learning outcomes, we also identified as important things like increased willingness of the employers to hire the youth. That's something that we identified. There might be a reason like employers might not be willing to hire people without experience. So if anyway through our programs you can increase the willingness of employers also to hire the youth, we identified that as an important outcome. But most of the points we got first for the assumptions and enablers. For example, because we're looking at a digital learning platform, one of the important assumption was that there's good internet speed connectivity and access to smartphones in the intervention areas. And also because we're looking at government bodies to be involved, like government bodies will support our program in terms of training programs for youths. And in terms of stakeholders, apart from education department, we also thought local NGOs and universities and colleges that are there in the local area, right? There could be a proper facility for trainings. So these are some of the things that we identified that are very critical and important for the year that we're looking at. Now, if I just move to slide 2. So we picked up the activity of a digital platform for e-learning because we thought that's something unique which is there. And we kind of derived a pathway through which we can achieve this particular activity. For example, initially we thought that we'll identify institutions that are equipped with IT facilities and resources who can be our partner in implementing this digital e-learning platform. And after that, we identify the software and hardware requirements that's required for our particular e-learning. And then we look at our target group, the youth, their demography, and also we'll map the sectors of industries that are available in the local area, and then prepare the training module accordingly. Because unless we have those, we don't want to train them on skill sets for which they don't have opportunities in the local area. So this is kind of a requirement mapping that we thought we'll do. Then developing the actual platform for learning. It should be user friendly. That's very important. And then it's kind of training of trainers. Like we will just train these trainers on the use of technology, and then ultimately we build the capacity of you through these e-learning platforms. So this is kind of the institutes that we prepared. And in terms of the scenario that we are seeing, so we didn't make any changes in the TOC per se, but a lot of discussions happened. For example, the main reason being most activities that we have mentioned, we felt that that there might not be a direct high impact because of the particular scenario, but something that we discussed was that similar to the previous session, right? The quality of training might get affected because we might be relying on government institutes for training, and if there's no proper coordination in the government department, the quality of training might get affected. But some interesting thing that came up was that, right, when you're looking at the outcomes, right, the impact of the outcomes, the outcome values might get affected. Like if you had government support, you might have achieved higher impact in terms of different outcomes. But because there'll be lack of government support, the team generally felt that, because this particular constraints, we might achieve lesser impact in terms of outcomes than we could have achieved when there was government support. So that kind of summarizes our team's.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Karthik. Actually, our group also discussed a similar sort of in similar way in a point on if the education CEO is not having buy-in, do we need to replace him, and who is well equipped to replace him within the ministry, because you still want ministry buy-in. At our end, it was a discussion more around scale up of the project. So if it has to have further impact than the activity itself, is it important to engage a government stakeholder And there's no right or wrong answer. Is it a yes or a no? And if yes, then how does the trajectory change? Thank you so much, everyone, for being so interactive in all of these sessions. We'll take a 5-7 minute break. Request everyone to please stay online while you do so. You can keep yourself muted and keep the video off. Grab yourself a beverage of choice, take a bio break, and if you can join us back, it's in about 5 to 8 minutes, that would be great. So I'll pause here and we'll be back in about 5 minutes or so. Thanks. I hope most of us are back from our break. There were a lot of questions in the previous session, especially while creating the theory of change on, when we have a sudden change in the theory of change, how does that perhaps influence monitoring, how we measure things, and would that then affect output and outcome, and in what ways? So that is actually a very nice segue to our next segment, which is going to be taken over by my colleague, Karthik. Karthik, if you can get us started on monitoring, please.
Thanks, Mudlia. Will we share the screen?
Yes, just give me 1 second.
Sure.
Over to you.
Thanks, Mudlia. Hi, everyone. I hope you had great learning from the first 2 sessions, and this is a continuation of the flow. So what we're trying to see here is, as we discussed in the previous 2 sessions, any intervention is never linear. It's always non-linear. For example, there are a lot of factors that affects any intervention. For example, taking into account the local context in which it's implemented, or this example, multi-determination effect, something that we'll discuss in future. So there's all these factors that affect the intervention that's never linear. Hence, it's important to have a measurement strategy for your organization or for the project that you're doing that will ensure that you capture all the necessary indicators in the monitoring and evaluation components separately. Maybe you can go to the next slide. Yeah. Now the main question that we want to answer is why do we need innovative approaches in measuring social impact? Why it is required? Why no standard ones? The answer is pretty simple. Because there's no standardization in any metrics or definition that we use in social impact or environmental impact. To compare it with, let's say, financial impact, right? So let's say we want to measure the financial performance of company, and we also want to measure social impact of any intervention. Now, just want to differentiate the challenges between these two, so that we can understand the complexity that involved in any kind of intervention. So we're looking at different aspects, right? For example, let's say strength of institutions. So the financial institutions have been around in the world for hundreds of years. And throughout these years, they've evolved different standards, protocols, and ratios, right? So most of the ratios are standardized. For example, we have this GAAP, which we call generally acceptable accounting principles. That basically guides all the financial performances of every organization in the world. So, for example, what we mentioned by net profit, right? That's standard across every sector and every geography. That doesn't vary. The definition of that doesn't vary. But if we take the example of social impact, right? Most of the organizations, the philanthropic organizations that we're working with are relatively young. That will come up in the past few decades. And even though there are many efforts ongoing to standardize the frameworks and definitions, but still there's a long way to go to standardize them. Just to give an example, so one of the important indicators on gender intervention is women economic empowerment. So if you just Google the term, right, how to measure women economic empowerment, you will get a list of different frameworks from different leading organizations that are working in this area. ICRW, CARE International. But if you see, they might look similar, but you can see differences in the indicators that they use. And if they use the same indicators, you can see the difference in the definition, like the way they define those indicators. So that's one real issue that we face, in terms of measuring social impact. And second is the control, because in terms of financial performance, we measure everything that's within the control of the firm. So in that case, you have greater control of what you're measuring. But if you look at social impact, the intervention happens outside the organization. Like it's either happening in the community level, where you have very less control, or if it's an environmental project, it's happening in the forest, where you have absolutely no control of what's happening and how it's going to happen. So you have very little control about the intervention that itself. That's how it's going to pan out. And next is the intuitive sense in terms of the indicators, right? For example, money, dollars or rupees. Everybody knows what it means. So if I say that the company is making 10 million profit, we know what 10 million means. We know the value of it, right? But if I say the same thing, right? Like if I say, like because of intervention, the agency of the woman improved by 10%. Now, first I have to say what agency means. I have to do a thorough background check of what agency means. So there's no intuitive sense of what the indicators are measuring in social impact sense, but which is different in a financial impact. Next is comparability, which I touched upon earlier. We have so many benchmarks and ratios. So I can easily compare two different companies. Like I can say that there are two fintechs that are there. One fintech is performing well, having a, let's say, a net profit of 10%. Other is having a profit of minus 5%. So I can easily compare because the benchmarks are standard. But that's extremely difficult in terms of social intervention because even the same interventions happening in two different geography, right? There might be after a local context also. It's not just the same standards, but local context have a great impact on the outcomes also. That's there. Next, last point, the fungibility. Fungibility is nothing but the ability of any goods or services to be interchanged with another goods and service. So in terms of financial impacts, right? If you're saying that one of the business areas are making a high profit and others not making a high profit, then what I can do is I can reallocate resources from one to the other to compensate for that. But that's not really a case in terms of social impact, right? I can't say that, this is providing a huge positive impact. I can take some of it and give it some other activities having a negative impact. That's not, that interchange is not possible. So like summarize to all these complexities, that's why, we need to have innovative approaches when you try to measure social impact. Next slide, Sundari. Yeah. Now, because we are discussing complex intervention, we just want to discuss about what are the measurement challenges that usually researchers face when they try to evaluate or monitor complex interventions. Now we have come up with a summary of 6 different challenges. So most of the challenges we came from our own learnings. Like we at LEAD do numerous primary research on different area topics like financial inclusion, enterprise development, gender. So we kind of created all the learnings from them and came up with this. And also we have done extensive secondary review also to understand what other researchers also facing in terms of challenges. And these are 6 different, like we bucket into 6 challenges, which we will discuss in detail in the coming slides. Next one. Yeah. So for each of the slides, I've given one example which will help us understand the challenges better. So the first is generalizability. In complex interventions, the effects are not produced just by the intervention itself, but it hugely depends on local context itself. So by generalizability, means that something that's working in a particular context should work in another context if it's applied with the same principles, right? So that is generalizability. But in terms of social impact, that's rarely possible because the local context plays a huge factor in that. So if you take an example of, we're talking about one project where we're trying to enforce child labor laws so that we can reduce child labor that's happening in a particular area. So in one of the country or geography, right, the local government leadership, that might be an enabling factor. That may be very proactive and very sincere. So they can actually be an enabling factor for your particular program. But if you take the same assumption to some other geography, let's say a country where corruption is high, in that country, the local government leadership might actually be the part of the problem. Like they might be taking bribes from these industries that are employing children, and they might actually be a part of the problem, impediment for your barrier for your project rather than enabler for your project. So it's always important to understand the local context. So usually what we recommend for that is, like before you start any intervention, you have to do a formative research, like you go to field, do a qualitative interview with different stakeholders, and you will understand the local context from that. Like, okay, in this area, these are the particular challenges that we're facing. And then you can use the standard theory of change from other similar studies, but you have to modify it based on your local context. So you could add and remove different activities and constraints based on local context. So this is the first issue that we want to discuss. Next slide. So next is confusion, what we say. This is nothing but, so for example, if you're TOC, you have activities, inputs, activities, outcomes, outputs. So this particular challenge happens when you miss out on some activity or any outcome to be mentioned in your TOC, or you measure something that's not part of your TOC. To give you by example, right? Let's say there's a malaria elimination program in Africa. So one of the common intervention for that is distributing insecticide treated bed nets. So the program is like we distribute the bed nets and then people use it, and then there's instance of malaria. So that's the pathway. But while designing your TOC under outputs, you have added number of bed nets distributed as one of the outputs, and impact is reduced incidence of malaria. Now you missed adding a particular important output to your TOC, which is number of people using bed nets regularly while sleeping. So when you measure, when you don't add this particular output and you measure your particular program, right, then you see that even though the bed nets has been distributed in large quantity, but the incidence has not reduced. The reason could be that you distributed the bed nets to the people, but actually they didn't use it for sleeping. What they used it for as fishing nets instead. Like there's a local like they're fishermen there, and they were in badly need of nets for fishing. So instead of using it as a bed net for sleeping, they used it for fishing activities. It's actually a real case scenario. So I'm not saying any this thing. It's actually happened in a place. So it's important to make sure that don't miss out any important components of the TOC. Because of which your entire assumption or the program doesn't work. If you're taking care of this particular assumption, then you might have understood in the midway itself. Okay, this particular thing is not working. Then you can course correct accordingly. Next slide, Nuria. Yeah. So inconsistency. Here we're talking about unreliability of measurements. So reliability basically means like we can ability to consistently measure the same variable with the same result again and again. That's something that the concept is there. I want to give an example of our own project which Lead is implementing right now. So we have this fund in which we are a grant management partner, where we have funded 9 different implementing partners across India, and they are working with women collectives. And now the complexity here is that the beneficiaries is not the same. In some of the projects, the beneficiaries are bamboo artisans. In some of the projects, the beneficiaries are kiranas or owners. In some of the projects, the beneficiaries are like women who are running food processing units. So this is the complexity we are facing. And one of the important and activity in all the projects is capacity building of the beneficiaries. And all the projects have this capacity building of beneficiaries in terms of business management skills. And now the issue we are facing is that like how do you define business management training, right? For example, one of the beneficiary is giving the business management training for only 1 day as 8 hours training. Well, another partner is giving the same training as a 8 days residential training. So they're calling them to a particular place and say detailed 8 days training. But if I say an overall, right, both of them are providing business management training, but the scale and the depth of the training is different. So if I generally assume that, right, if I do a project level evaluation, not individual evaluation, and I just draw this pathway, right, like people are trained on business management skills, because of that the turnover is increased. That's the outcome I'm measuring. If I just take it at the overall intervention level, right, then I might not see the impact, because the training is different for different partners. So we have to face these kind of issues we usually face. So one of the recommendations for this is that as mentioned earlier, currently many organizations are working to standardize the indicators. So one of the examples is the Emerge platform, which has been developed by University of California, San Diego, where they're trying to standardize definitions for indicators related to gender, like education, gender-based violence, women economic empowerment. So what they do is they recommend what should be standard indicators that should be used for each of these definitions. And many of the organizations working in this sector usually follow those. So in this way, we'll be able to standardize each and every indicator and use it so that there's possible comparability later. Next slide, Madhuri. Yeah. Misunderstanding is nothing but so we have this causal validity, right? So we are saying that there's a cause because of this effect will happen. So this particular challenge happens when we misread the cause and effect relationship. Like there can be 2 kinds of errors in that. One is commission error and this omission error. So commission error is nothing but we know this, right? Correlation is not causality. It's nothing but 2 factors happening because of coincidence, not really an that cause and effect relationship, but we assume it as a cause and effect relationship in our program. And the second is like there's some important factors that are very difficult to identify in our particular TOC, and we kind of omit it from our TOC. So these are 2 different kinds of 2 different kinds of errors. I'll just give a simple example. Like there's a program to improve the employment level in a particular area. Now, generally we see that there's lack of motivation in the area for the youth to work. Now, to understand whether people are demotivated because there's lack of jobs, or lack of jobs are related to, or lack of jobs has like led to demotivation among people. So this is kind of reverse causation, right? Like we first have to establish whether motivation has led to unemployment or unemployment has led to demotivation. So that's something that people usually confuse. And if you take the relationship wrong, then the impact you're going to measure, that's going to be a very faulty one. That's something that we have to take care of. Next slide, Madhu. Next is oversimplification. That like what discussed detailed in Mridula's session, right? Like rarely problems are simplistic. Like there's no single activity or an effect that can solve the problem, right? So usually what happens is, like, if you just focus on one problem, then we can't achieve the impact that we require. One of the examples is, like, for example, there's a big corporate. They're running a rehabilitation program to stop teen drug abuse, like in a particular area. Now they have seen that training the team on how to avoid peer pressure. They've seen that leads to reduced instance of drug use. So that might be a really good thing. Right? That might be a strong causation. Like that might be the main cause for teen drug abuse, right? But if we don't take care of other aspects also, for example, one of the other activities that leads to teen drug abuse is that availability of prescription drugs at home, right? Like cough syrup and all, right? So easy availability of them, access to them. That's also one of the reasons for teen drug abuse. So if in an intervention we just focus on training on avoiding peer pressure and not take care of these kind of other activities, then truly we are not addressing the actual problem. Then the impact of what you want to see will not actually see it. So the recommendation for that is, like in your project you can focus on one particular cause, but you have to make sure that you study all other causes and then establish that those causes are not significant for a particular intervention. After that only you can be sure that the simplistic program design can be used for my evaluation. Next slide. Yeah. So this is the last of the measurement that we want to discuss. So this is especially applicable to any intervention on the environmental side. So many social impact measurements omit either the upside or the downside risks of an intervention. To just give an example, right? Let's say there's a mining company that's working in a forest where the community lives nearby. So what the mining company is doing is that they are partnering with a local charity, and they have funded the charity to do some education intervention for the community children. So the let's say the partnership is going well. The children are getting trained. There's a positive impact because of that. But unless the mining company identifies the risks because of its environmental impact, right? Because of the business, let's say there's a huge water pollution in the area. If they're not addressing that issue and they just focus on the education as a intervention, right? Then there can be some positive effects because of the education intervention, but there'll always be negative effects because of the water pollution that's happening. So usually what we recommend is that, that's the thing we're going to say. The positive impact of a particular impact will not reduce the negative impact of another particular impact. That's what we described as fungibility, right? So usually what organizations do is they have this ESG frameworks, especially for environmental impacts, where they try to understand what are the social and economic impacts that their business create, not their philanthropic works. So you would identify what the impact their businesses create, the activity that they create, and then try to derive or design intervention according to like alongside those particular business line, so that you take care of the negative impacts of your businesses also. So this is like, next slide please, Nudya. Yeah, so this is some kind of summary of the general complex intervention. But because we have done extensive studies on like human economic empowerment and other gender related issues, we just wanted to highlight some specific challenges that are specific to gender related interventions. So first one is that decision making outcomes. So agency, which we say is like the ability of the woman to make decisions, independent decisions, the important factor for any woman empowerment program. So usually what we do is, how do we measure agency is that we do a survey with women respondents and ask them, we ask a set of activities. Now, do you take decisions regarding this before the intervention, after the intervention? Basically a survey. But the problem with that is that's prone to biases. Like ideally what we want to see is we want to observe the decision making in real life, right? We want to see, like in actual real life, they have a decision to make, how they make it, but that's not possible. So what we do is we give them a choice and we ask them what to do. That's where totally outcomes of choice, not actually the actual real decision making. So in that case, what we usually do is we use non-survey instruments. We don't use a primary survey kind of thing. what we do is, for example, we design experimental vignettes where we give a hypothetical situation about decision making and ask them to respond to that. In this way, they remove the personal touch of the woman. We're not asking anything personal to her. We're giving a hypothetical situation about case, and we're asking about decision making regarding that. And these kind of things have been found to be working well to measure decision making outcomes. Next slide, please. Yeah, this is one of the important biases that we face in gender-based studies. Like most of the topics we use in study in these projects are very sensitive topics. For example, reproductive health, family planning usage, domestic violence, and decision making. So usually, if you just ask this question directly, it might lead to reporting bias. Something we call as social disability bias. Like people would want to say that what we want to hear. They will not say what they're actually facing. So we'll just give an example of our own survey. So we're doing a survey to study, to understand the workforce participation of women in some states of India. So we know this, right? Like the workforce participation rate in India is declining for women in the past few decades, past few years. And it's a matter of great concern. So as part of that, we are doing a small study with the business owners, not with the women, but with the enterprise owners, to understand whether there's any inherent bias in recruitment. For example, whether women owners prefer recruiting women employees and male owners prefer recruiting male employees. We just want to understand this bias. So for that, if you ask them directly, right, like whether do you hire based on the gender of the employee, you always get social disabled answers. Like, no, I just look at skill sets. So what we did was we designed a choice experiment study where, we give them a hypothetical situation, right? We give them 4 variables. So based on gender, education of the employee, marital status, and skill sets. So we give them the scenario where for one of the owner, we ask them, for example, there's a potential employee who's a college graduate, who's unmarried, and who's a male, and these are skill sets, will you hire him or not? And to different owner, we'll say them the same set of criteria, but we change the gender of the person. We say that there's a potential employee who's a female, college graduated, unmarried, and have the same skills. Will you hire or not? So in this way, what we're doing is we're assigning random set of profiles to different business owners, and we're removing the biases that will come from that. We're not asking them whether they have this thing, but we give hypothetical scenarios for them. I remove the biasness because of that. So the study is still ongoing, and we're looking at some interesting findings from that, like which we'll share when we publish those things. Next slide. Yeah. So this, I think we discussed in the general challenges, like taking the local context into account, right? Something that might happen, that might be enabler in a particular geography, may not be enable in other things. Usually what we recommend is that in terms of the indicators that you want to measure, have a mix of both. Have indicators that are locally tailored, like based on the local context, but also have standard indicators from different platforms, right? So that, we can compare it with other geographies and also contribute to the generalizable knowledge of the particular program. That's something that we recommend for taking care of the context. Next slide, Madhulya. Yeah, sorry, the previous slide. Yeah. So next is the the power of social institutions and norms. So generally, what happens is women internalize society's views as their own views. To give an example, so there are lots of surveys that goes on domestic violence. That studies domestic violence, and in all of these studies, there's a small proportion of women who say that it's a right for a husband to beat his wife if she doesn't listen to her. Now this is like, now we can't take it as the personal view of the like the woman. This is more like a societal view that the woman is accepted as a acceptable way of life, right? So this is some issues that we face always. So in this case, the researchers that we're doing research need to be more careful not to impose any outsider view on what the woman should want. So in terms of measuring inequalities in these situations, we don't measure just inequality, but also the context in which this inequality is happening. That's something you need to take care of when you're doing the measurements. Yeah, next slide, maybe. So now what we've done is, so we have discussed the challenges till now that generally occurs in any complex intervention or gender-based studies. We want to present 2 case studies discussing some of our work. to showcase to you like how we have tried to overcome some of these hurdles in measurement. So one of the studies that we were doing a study to understand the market landscape and enterprise readiness of woman-based like woman-led home-based businesses in 2 states of India. So as part of the study, we want to develop a scorecard, like the business readiness scorecard for the women, to try to understand like how ready the business is for expansion. Now the issue is that how do we define business readiness for a woman entrepreneur? Because business readiness is a very complex term, right? Like business readiness can be in terms of the woman's ability. It can be in terms of the kind of business they're doing. It can be in terms of what kind of market linkages they have. It's not a single definition that we can use. So our objective was to come up with the easy to understand way to define business readiness. And it's not like we define business in 10 different ways. That's not very suitable. So we came up with a framework to measure business readiness scorecard. I can see in the right hand side of it. I like apologies for it's. I think it's not very legible, but basically we had 4 focus areas where we felt that the woman's business readiness should be measured. One is the agency of the woman herself, or own decision making and empowerment and risk appetite, and then market readiness, whether there's access to market in an area, whether she has enough product portfolio for accessing like sufficient for the market. Next is the production readiness, trying to see in terms of production, like our own manufacturing setup, does her have enough capabilities and equipments to grow. And the 4th focus area was the legal and regulatory environment, whether it's a formal enterprise and whether they have access to different government schemes that is available. So we kind of developed this kind of framework where we have 4 focus areas and around 11, 12 indicators. Next slide, Nurlia. Yeah. Now the issue was that how do we combine these 12 different indicators into a single indicator, where we can say that a particular woman entrepreneur is this much, like let's say 90% ready for business expansion, right? So all of you would have heard of composite indexes. For example, we have this global development index by UNDP, which rates each country in terms of their development. For example, India currently stands at 131 out of 187 countries. So composite index is something very common in the development sector. So what we did was we developed a data-driven composite index that will not only measure the woman's ability in terms of economic skill, but also in terms of social, cultural, and behavioral parameters. So what's unique about what we did was, usually what happens is in any kind of a composite index, there are 2 things. One is aggregation, second is weighting. Like let's say you have 10 indicators, how much weightage will you give for each indicator? For example, in this global development index, there are 3 indicators, and they're given equal weightage for all the 3. And this is not based on any any kind of statistical techniques, but basically they're saying that we feel that all these 3 indicators are equally important. But actually what we did was, because we had 12 indicators and they're very complex in nature, we kind of used a statistical technique called multiple correspondence analysis. This is similar to principal component analysis, but there's some specific differences in this, which was more suitable for us. So we use this multiple correspondence analysis technique to develop this index for each of this women using objective weighting. Like we are not giving weights by ourselves for each indicator, but based on the outcome we are trying to measure, the technique itself assigns weights for each of the indicator based on the importance on the outcomes. So you can just see that summary in the graph below. For example, Rajasthan, you see out of 10, it's a score out of 0 to 10. The composite index is a score of 0 to 10. Rajasthan, the women have a mean score of 2.6. Median score of 2.6. Compared to the Tamil Nadu, we have score of 3.2. And if you see in terms of different sub-indexes, right, we can see that market readiness is lowest in both the states. Like that's something that the government should try to address. Like even though the agency of the women have a high score in both the states, but because of market readiness, low score, and low score in legal and regulatory environment, the overall ability to scale up and grow in the businesses is getting affected. So we came up with this innovative way where we try to show try to show the policymakers and how we can measure the business scorecard for women. Next slide. I think I'm just running out of time. Just quickly wrap it. So this is a second case study that we try to see where we're trying to measure trust score for access and credit. So we're doing this. We're doing a study to assess the financial products accessed by women and the source of credit that they access, the women entrepreneurs. So just to give background, so even the women entrepreneurs contribute significantly to the Indian economy, right? But the biggest barrier that they face is, they have restricted access to financial resources. The main reason being, mostly women entrepreneurs don't have credit history because they've not done any bank transactions before. They don't have any credit history. Because of that, banks or NBFCs usually not willing to give credit to them. So there are many innovative tools that have come up to kind of alternative to the credit score that we have. Next slide, please. So we tried to develop something called trust score. We gave them the name of trust score as an alternative to the credit score. And this is not based on the usual parameters used by the banks, right? The banks use parameters like how much assets you have, what's your repayment behavior. But we try to develop the trust score based on the entrepreneur's behavior. Like we kind of administer the psychometric tool to them, and we try to see whether we can develop some scores based on the entrepreneur's behavior and ability to repay. See the next slide. So basically, what we did was we partnered with Careerfin. So Careerfin is a fintech platform that's working. So what we did was we developed a psychometric assessment tool, and we administered this tool to our respondents in different states who are unbanked, who don't have access to credit. And we also administer the same set of psychometric tools to some of the Careerfin's customers, like who are similar to our respondents in terms of their profile. And they have we have the credit score for them and the behavior also. So what basically we did was we kind of run a model, statistical model, where we use the different data to train the model, because we have both the trust score as well as the financial behavior. And in that model, we fit in our respondents' data and try to come up with a model which can predict the trust score, like which can give us a trust score for each of the respondents, even though they are unbanked. So basically, what we saw was that the trust score we developed through this process, that is very close to the credit score that the banks develop, and it reflects the actual credit behavior of the respondent. So this is one of the innovative approaches we followed, where we want to we suggested this to policymakers also, where for unbanked population, let's look at alternate methods of scoring them for access to credit rather than credit scores. So I think that's all from me. Just one slide at the end. Because we're running out of time, I'm just putting it on chat. They can go to the next slide, please. Yeah. So I just want to give you an hypothetical situation, right? Let's say somebody asked you to measure happiness of people. Now, how do you measure happiness? There can be different methods. Like there can be biological markers. You can measure their hormone levels and say, okay, if it's this much hormone level, then they're happy. But there can be behavioral ways also, right? You can observe a person, how many times they smile, how many times they laugh, how many times they frown, and come up with some kind of happiness measure, right? And even countries are trying to do that. Like they're trying to see how can we have an happiness index that can be alternative to GDP. Yeah, the happiness can be developed. I can see that in the chat. Now, my question to you is that, based on the conversation that we had now, right, in terms of challenges that we are facing, if you can just identify some of the main challenges that you will face if you have to measure happiness of people. I don't want you because we're running out of time, we just put your comments on the chat. I think that would be helpful for us. Like you can just mention, according to you, what are the challenges you will face if you're measuring happiness of people? I think something that we can discuss maybe in the last Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Karthik. So just 2 points there for everyone. This last point that Karthik has mentioned on measuring happiness, you can put your responses in the chat. We can bring this up again towards the end. So A, how would you measure it? What is the indicator you could potentially think of? Also, what are the challenges that you anticipate running into while measuring something like happiness? Thank you so much, Karthik, for that session, which moves us to our last session. I request Shona to please join us. And this session is on evaluation methods in times of complexity. Many of these reports are also available on our website. So if you're curious about any of the cases that have been mentioned in the session so far, you should be able to find the links and details on lead at Korea University's website. Thank you so much, Shona. Over to you.
Thanks, Madhya. And yeah, I've been listening to the entire conversation, and probably I would not be adding a lot to what we have already been discussing, especially in the sessions that Karthik was just speaking about, or maybe what Sujata was elaborating on. But I'm just going to focus on some of the few things that we come across when evaluating very complex programs. And it is the not only about the cohorts that the programs are targeted towards or other things, but what I want to focus on especially is the complexities that the governance systems have, and what it means for getting a better evaluation in terms of negotiating those complex governance systems. And that basically brings us to the whiteboard at the beginning by saying that what is it, or where do we start in terms of looking at programs, whether to look at the designs of the programs, whether the programs are actually designed to negotiate the complexities of the governance, or whether it is basically programs that are also suitably mechanized to negotiate the complex implementation processes, which very complex governance systems sometimes create difficulties with. So what I'm trying to say is basically, even when we have the most simply designed programs and policies, the governance systems, especially in countries which have decentralized systems of governance, and that is not to say that decentralized systems of governance are not advisable or not. I mean, those are probably one of the best ways of functioning, the decentralized systems of governance. But in that, what I wanted to highlight is basically sometimes not properly decentralized systems or properly decentralized systems of governance actually create issues in terms of implementations of programs, and that gets caught in the evaluation as systemic bottlenecks, as mechanisms that sometimes the objectives of the programs do not get fulfilled because of the implementation bottlenecks, because of the bottlenecks that emerge due to something so systemic and so rigid to the governance structure that it is very difficult to negotiate that, and even simplest of the programs do not achieve the objectives as expected. Going to the next first slide, basically, what I want to highlight, therefore, is how to facilitate a systematic approach to evaluating programs within systems where the governance structures are complex. And this is something that is relevant for all countries where governance structures are evolved, and also where governance structures are not so evolved, but they may be very complex. Multiple layers of accountability needs to be ensured in achieving the objectives of the program, and that are and sometimes before even getting to the reaching the end of the evaluation, sometimes the entire evaluation gets stuck at the middle level, where the systemic rigidities are so strong and so much more pronounced that one actually cannot look beyond the governance system and see what has been the impact of the program's implementation. So just to go to the next slide, what I want to highlight here is basically that there is no seamless implementation, even for the simplest of programs. Simplest of programs meaning, supposing we have just one objective to fulfill for one single cohort of the population, and even there might be bottlenecks if the program design is not taking into consideration the circumstances, or it is not taking into consideration the complexities involved in the governance of the systems. Even if it is a program where it is the local bodies, I mean, implemented by local bodies, that is lowest level of the subnational governance structures, even there, sometimes it is not, the implementation problems may still be due to several bottlenecks of the system. And those are the things that I would just highlight. And of course, when we moved from a simple program into a more complex program, we are talking about multiple stakeholders, and multiple stakeholders are present in every program, even the simple programs. And accordingly, the choice of tools and methods are employed. Now, we have discussed a lot on the choice of tools and methods and frameworks, how we want to look at every evaluation. And just one highlight is every evaluation is different. Every evaluation is different depending upon what are the end objectives of the evaluation. While we have some set paradigms for evaluation structures and evaluation frameworks, and there are very many steps that all evaluation studies or all evaluations like to follow and love to follow, but they actually can be modified. They can be, they should be flexible enough to take into consideration all the other complexities involved in the entire, not only in the governance structure, but also the way the governance structure impacts the other systems, processes, and mechanisms in the level at which the implementation of the program takes place. In the next slide, basically, there are no good evaluation frameworks. So what do we understand by good evaluation frameworks? Evaluation frameworks have to be modified according to the needs. And while we know that there are some set types of evaluation methods like goal-based, process-based, outcome-based, or even a summative evaluation, and each of it has its own pros and cons and are able to capture some of the good practices. And some, those are good in terms of evaluating whether the program has been able to achieve its end properly, but there are also, and does not really understand what went in the process and the mechanism in between. There are also evaluation frameworks that basically focus on the interim to find out how to better the programs, how to improve the program, and how to improve the design and implementation if those flexibilities are available. And probably those are some of the, and that is my personal opinion, and that those are sometimes the good evaluation frameworks where we have the flexibility and we have the ability to modify as we move on with the programs. That is iterative at all stages, and that helps in a lot of things. In the next slide, basically what I want to highlight is that there are, there are three other types. Steps for, as I said, the steps for evaluation would be more or less very similar for all types, but priorities and focus on those steps will differ depending upon the type of evaluation. I'm going to try and explain what I'm saying by citing two examples, one from a process-based evaluation and one from a summative sort of evaluation. And both of them have had very different objectives. And the next slide, please, where in the next slide, I'll just go through some of the steps that we usually try to follow try to follow to provide better evaluation frameworks. Can we just go to the next slide?
Hi, Shona, do we still have you with us?
No, can we go to the next slide?
Yeah, there. Is this
Yeah,
one?
thanks. So basically, as we say that there are usually, I mean, if you look at some normal steps, and I just thought we'll break it into some 10 steps for evaluation, as has been done by many research-based and academic evaluations as well, that first we try to identify and clarify what is to be evaluated. So to highlight or to clearly define the goals, the population, the strategies, what kind of activities, outputs and outcomes, basically look at the nitty-gritties of the program design. And that clearly provides the complexities involved in the programs. And that is something that is very important to note down at the beginning of any proper evaluation. Now, I'm speaking to an audience who have basically done all of these and are enthusiastic about following all of this in there and have been doing this, are already doing it. But just to reiterate the importance of clarifying what is to be evaluated at the beginning to create a proper theory of change. And that probably sets the goal or sets the tone of the evaluation framework. Now, once we identify that, we also start identifying who are the stakeholders and how do we engage them, because engaging stakeholders is another important pillar of any proper evaluation, because a success of an evaluation actually depends on the support that we get from the stakeholders. And stakeholders are often very instrumental in terms of offering to stakeholders are, I mean, in terms of offering advice to what the type of recommendations that evaluations actually come up with. And which is why, while it is very, very difficult and arduous to engage with a lot of stakeholders if the program entails that, but it is also very fruitful. So that is another crucial, especially in the process-based evaluation, engaging with the stakeholders who are currently also engaging with the program is very, very essential. Of course, assessing resource and evaluability, which is basically an honest assessment of resources to avoid constraints in the evaluation, is very important, especially the goals that are identified for evaluation, to understand whether they can be evaluated at all or not, especially those which are qualitative based, those which are trying to talk about social impact. And those are things that need to be highlighted or clarified at the beginning. Based on that, we actually move ahead to identify and determine questions, basically develop our own instruments and methods of measurement and processes, deploy credible methods to use and detailed plans on data collection. And that is when the critical challenges happen in terms of how do we collect the data. And that is when also the methods come into play. What are the methods that we use? And from a personal experience of having done evaluations, I think mixed methods of collecting data always leads to provide better insights into the evaluations. And mixed methods call for structured interviews, semi-structured interviews, structured questionnaire-based surveys with beneficiaries or target population. So basically that detailed evaluation plan, the number of activities, the number of tasks, the allocations, if resource allocations, roles of the team members, all these detailed evaluation plan needs to be developed before we get into any of the evaluative exercises. And these are very, very important, especially when we are doing some summative evaluations. However, the main challenge lies in the collection of data. While we can actually develop as many tools as possible and deploy mixed methods of obtaining and collecting the information, the more mixed methods we use, the more complicated the training of the enumerators become. So that is while we say that mixed methods and applying FGD, focus group discussions or qualitative methods and quantitative methods are important, it is also to be remembered that the more we get into these procedures, training of data collection also becomes a very complicated affair, especially when we are doing process-based evaluation, which depends on iteration and which is very, very time sensitive and has to be conducted in very brief period. So those kinds of trainings become difficult to conduct. And therefore, what we try to do is, what we try to do is basically shorten or develop methods that are quick and easy. And sometimes that creates another challenge of missing out on important information that would feed into the iterative mechanism. Of course, the next steps are very clear that we all do, and that is needed to be done for every evaluation that takes place, which is basically processing and analyzing the data and interpreting and disseminating them. So the next slide, please. So as I said, that I would be giving examples of process-based evaluation and the summative evaluation that we had done just last year. Completed last year and last year, so consecutively. And a process-based evaluation is a complex, time-sensitive, multiple challenges based on the number of objectives. And I already spoke about this, so we can skip the slide and move to the main slide, next slide. And this is where the case study begins, that there was this program of a 3D program of document, drive, and deliver for women and girls. The entire objective of the program was to create a knowledge and evidence-based intersectoral convergent mechanism involving government departments, private sector, and civil society, including bringing in girls and women to design interventions that foster economic empowerment and address health, education, and safety needs of girls and women. So as you can see that there are several components to this program, which actually appears to be a very simple program, which is talking about building a simple platform that is going to raise awareness among women and girls to basically be able to access health, education, and safety programs. But it has several components and several government departments, and it entails several government departments to come together, as well as bring in private sector and civil society, as most programs are implemented in public-private partnership models. And therefore, this range of stakeholders to the program has been very wide. And of course, the 3D program within its delivery mechanism introduced 3 key systems in place, namely convergent planning process at the level of local governments by bringing together several departments of the government. So that, as I said, that bringing together several departments of the government is not an easy task, given the fact that if you have a very complex structure, you have government departments which are more than one in each of the ministries, and bringing them together for providing, for delivering one program is actually a very, very difficult aspect of any program. So next slide, please, Mridula. And so the objectives, as I said, was basically to empower women and girls through providing them with platforms and raising their awareness that would work towards improving their economic empowerment, and link together diverse stakeholders, provide them with mechanisms where they can come together and work together and stay together to ensure that the implementation of the program is implementation of the program is a success, and also develop a platform of sharing knowledge, evidence, and information. Now, given this, there was also an additional objective of creating a system of evidence-based planning to maximize the efficiency of the government programs. and in terms of the last mile connect and reaching out to the beneficiaries. Now, this is one additional objective, but a very important objective for this program that was being implemented in, in two districts in Maharashtra, basically the districts that we were doing the evaluation for, and one in rural and one in urban. And this seemed to be a major challenge because while it was easier to raise awareness and create the platform which could make women and girls aware of the programs and the delivery mechanisms, but having a continuous source of information built into a digital platform that would feed into the entire process of the program was something that was very, very difficult to achieve in both the in both the sectors. So if we can just go to the next slide. So this next slide.
Time check, please. 10 minutes.
And this is basically in a matrix, just the clear picture of what the program entailed. And as you can see that the partners, so in the rural area, it was in the urban area, it was basically the Pune, one of the municipalities in Pune that we were looking at. And in the rural areas, it was one of the blocks that we were looking to see how the 3D program was working out. And as you can see that there were a number of partners, including international NGOs, civil society, grassroots civil society organizations, corporate leaders, researchers, as well as the government, all the government departments. Now, and the goal, of course, we just spoke about the goals. And basically, one of the important initiatives of the program was to develop an index to assess the quality of the government's programs, and then implement skill training, job placement, awareness programs, improve the trust on the safety of public transportation for college, for school and college girls. So there were multiple objectives. There were multiple stakeholders, and there was and the scope of the work was 2 to 3 villages in each block, and one ward, as I said, one ward in the urban areas. So this was one in a nutshell, the overall 3D program and the process-based evaluation that we were, just next slide, please. And the process-based evaluation, basically, we were following the approach, which is very central to this kind of an evaluation, to yield effective results with interim iterations. And one of the major objectives of the evaluation was to understand whether the effectiveness in achievement of planned outcomes and contribution of interventions undertaken to improve socioeconomic health and socioeconomic and health outcomes for girls and women. The contribution of interventions to increase efficiency in local government, and what was the sustainability and scalability of these interventions. And it was found, as we suggested, that one of the major challenges, the next slide please, one of the major challenges that we faced, this is, and the framework was of course based on the OECD development commitment, and we can move to the next slide. Yeah, and this was modified and also modified a bit to take care of the objectives of our evaluation program. Just go back, are we just
this slide or the next one?
No, the previous one.
Previous one. This one?
Yeah. Just stay here. Okay.
All right.
Just hold on. Yeah, I think so basically, one of the major challenges in carrying out the process-based evaluation actually cropped up in data collection, which was due to one of the factors was due to the fact that we were looking at beneficiaries who were manual scavengers working with waste pickers working in the city. And it was very difficult to access those beneficiaries. However, apart from that, there were multiple government departments involved, and talking to them, interviewing them through using semi-structured questionnaires was something that we faced challenges with bringing them on board, having to get a time and interview them. Also, because we had corporate partners, and it was very challenging to get the time from the corporate partners, and even if when we got the time, it was very difficult to get them to speak properly. At times, it was also about the awareness about the program with the highest level of the leadership in the corporate or in the government. It was basically we were looking for the right stakeholders to speak with. So identifying stakeholders was another challenge in terms of carrying out the evaluation. Of course, governance structures are part of this, and on top of everything, while we were on it, the pandemic struck, and the entire beneficiary survey had to be done over phone. So we were conducting interviews using digital platforms. We were talking over the phone. We were using, the method of data collection shifted to digital platforms, which hampered the quality of the data collection, which reduced the sample size because we were not getting everyone. All the beneficiaries do not have phone, and we could not get access. So data quality was compromised. And how did we negotiate that? We were basically substituting all of it by long form interviews with individuals. And of course, that created lots of delays in execution and dissemination of findings. So these were some of the challenges that we had been facing in the evaluation, process-based evaluation. So while it is iterative and we were supposed to provide inputs for improvement, and which we did, but if there is a natural disaster, or if there is any kind of health crisis or public health crisis that strikes even at the local level, I think process-based, any evaluation gets hampered, especially process-based, which is time-sensitive and is also and which is time-sensitive, but it is also helpful that a process-based evaluation can actually provide with inputs that help in negotiating with those with the ongoing crisis. So one of the advantages that we had was to provide insights on how to also negotiate a bit with the crisis that was that the population was facing at that moment of the time. So yes, of course. So this was one of the examples that I wanted to cite, and then we go to the next one, please, Mridulya.
Sure, Shona. Just a heads up, a time check, please. 5 to 7 minutes request.
I'll just do it in 3 minutes. And then we had another very important program of Beti Bachao, Beti Padhao, which means that save the girl child and educate the girl child. And this program, which was launched in 2015, we were trying to do a summative evaluation. A summative evaluation not only looks at only the governance aspect, it starts from the beginning and goes till the end of from the program design to its implementation, to its financial governance, to its structural governance, and every part of it. And and while this is a summary of how the program was implemented in phases, the key objectives of the program was to prevent sex-selective abortion and ensure. One of the important objectives was to improve the child sex ratio in the country and increase female participation in education. Now, the complexity of this program again was in the fact that while there was a central union ministry who was involved in rolling out the entire program, it had to bring in two more ministries, Ministry of Health and Family Welfare and Human Resource Development, which is also the Education Ministry in India. Those together in order to achieve its success. And what we found was that while the program design articulated all these needs, the challenges of the programs in our evaluation cropped up in two dimensions. One was in terms of putting together, bringing together all the relevant stakeholders in the ministries. This is a full-fledged government program, no private stakeholders involved. So what we conducted for our evaluation, we conducted surveys within beneficiaries and also interviews with parents and teachers to see whether awareness around educating the girl child and also awareness around the awareness against feticide has increased or not. And what we found is while the awareness campaigns were very, very effective in terms of reaching out to the people, whether it had its impact on ground in terms of reducing the child sex, in fact, in improving the child sex ratio and increasing the enrollment of girls in school, that wasn't clear because there were issues about financial governance within the entire program. So what we found in a summative evaluation when you do it is that there are problems of design, there are problems of implementation, and also there are problems of bringing together multiple government departments to work on one single program. And one of the important things that we realized that we were told from the stakeholder interviews that ministries, it's very difficult for ministries to come together for implementing a single program, and therefore every ministry has its own program, and it is very difficult to get the others to come and contribute to that program because each one wants success for its own program. So that was one of the very important findings that we had apart from the financial governance things. But then of course, the objective of saying this in this session is basically to highlight that a summative evaluation can actually give you very, very deep insights into the exact, into some of the very key problems or very key systemic issues within the systemic issues. And yeah, so basically, next slide, please. Yeah. So the next, I think this is is this the last one? Just. Yeah, so this is basically, that is what I wanted to end with. A summative evaluation can potentially provide insights on very key aspects of programs, which is not possible by process-based evaluation. So both have their own pros and cons. A very good evaluation for any program would be to employ both the methods of process and summative evaluation. And yeah, I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shona, and I'm sorry for having to rush you through this. Just want to make sure we have time for Q&A. Some of these questions that have been posed by the attendees of this workshop, I think those have been answered in the chat itself. But in case there are any other questions, I think we have about 5-7 minutes. So possibility to take definitely about 4-5 questions or so. If you would just like to unmute yourself, state your name, and if you have a question, and we'd be happy to answer it. Please keep it brief though, so we can squeeze as many questions in as possible. Are there any questions from any of the participants?
Yes, one question. Now, all these evaluations are related to some sort of beneficiaries are directly the human being. So, for example, if we have developed some flyover and the purpose is to reduce congestion, so can we evaluate those projects using these concepts where directly the ultimate beneficiaries are human beings, but intermediaries are reduction of time, travel time, and so on. Thank you.
Thanks, Sabine. Shona, do you want to take on that question?
I think it was more of a comment, and I kind of agree with that. Absolutely, yes.
Noted. So I think we're in agreement with what you're saying there, Sabine. Any of the other questions? I know there are a lot of queries or requests for accessing the presentation copies. Just clarifying that the organizers will share it after the workshop with all of you.
So if there are no questions, then
I know there's an ongoing discussion around happiness, which
happiness is a very complex term. Even I don't have answers for most of the things. This is just to keep everybody's brain ticking, right? Because things can be as complex as my happiness. So we're happy to take it offline and in this.
Yeah, noted, Karthik. Completely agree on that also. I think that was also the idea of doing that exercise is there are so many multiple ways of measuring the same concept. But yeah, point noted. And if there are any queries, please do feel free to reach out to us. I hope we've done sort of justice to walking you through this journey of what are the different complexities to keep in mind, what are the different tools and frameworks that can potentially help you with that, and what is the role of each of these tools and frameworks across the entire project lifecycle. So whether it's in an ideation, pre-planning stage, implementation stage, or measurement and evaluation thereafter. If there are any further questions, please do write to us. Feel free to reach out to us directly, and we'll do our best to get back to you with responses. Thank you for your time, and Aniruddha, back to you.
Thank you, everybody, for joining in and listening to this interesting and various aspects of evaluation. Yes, the presentations and all the recording of the this workshop would be available to whoever has registered for this. Definitely, this will you will be able to access it, and we will also share it with you. Formally, on behalf of Evaluation Community of India and Asia Pacific Evaluation Association, I would like to thank a lead at Korea University for taking this challenge and doing this workshop, such a wonderfully done workshop, and they do deserve a round of applause from all our side. Thank you for doing it, and thank you, Sona, Sujata, Mridulya, and Karthik for putting in so much of effort. Much appreciated from our side. Great job. Thank you. Thanks, all of you. And see you tomorrow for the next 3 days also in various sessions, and we can also share and learn from that. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.